Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a story that history wrote in grand gestures but whispered in quiet corners. May 2nd, 1536. A queen walks into the Tower of London. Same rooms, same view of the Thames. 3 years ago she entered as triumph itself, pregnant with the future, draped in cloth of gold. Today she is a prisoner, accused of crimes so scandalous that England will whisper about them for 500 years. This is not the story they told you in school. This is Anne Boleyn's last 17 nights on earth, and what happened when the crown became a cage. Now, before we step into that room together, I want to ask you something. If you are finding comfort in this story, if you appreciate the research and care that goes into bringing you these forgotten moments of history, would you take just a second to subscribe to this channel? Hit that like button if you're enjoying this, or leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from, what time it is in your corner of the world right now. Are you in bed in California on a night shift in London? Maybe it is raining where you are, or maybe the stars are out. I would genuinely love to know. And hey, if you've ever wondered what it was like to sleep in a palace built for celebration but used as a prison, well, you're about to find out. So dim those lights, let the world outside fade away, and let us step back almost 500 years to a room where queens waited. Not for coronations this time, but for something far more final. Let us begin. It is 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in May, and Anne Boleyn is being rowed up the Thames toward the Tower of London. The river is crowded, as it always is. Merchant boats, fishing vessels, people going about their ordinary lives, probably not noticing the royal barge carrying England's queen to her imprisonment. Or maybe they noticed. Maybe they watched. Maybe some of them already knew. We do not have to imagine how Anne felt in that moment, because someone wrote it down. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, the man responsible for keeping prisoners secure, he kept detailed records of everything Anne said and did from the moment she arrived. Not because he was a historian, not because he cared about her legacy, but because Thomas Cromwell, the King's chief minister, the man orchestrating this entire catastrophe, demanded regular reports. Every word, every gesture, every moment of weakness. So we know exactly what happened when Anne's barge docked at the Tower. We know she entered through the court gate of the Byward Tower, not through Traitor's Gate as movies love to show you. That is a myth. She came in the proper entrance because she was still queen, technically. And we know that when she arrived, she fell to her knees right there on the stones and begged the lords accompanying her to tell the king she was innocent. She literally dropped to her knees in front of her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, and he just walked away. Then Sir William Kingston stepped forward. He was about 60 years old at this point, a veteran courtier who had seen everything, held some of the most important prisoners in England. This was not his first rodeo, but even he seemed a bit taken aback by what he was witnessing, because Anne asked him very directly, "Mr. Kingston, shall I go into a dungeon?" Think about that question for a second. She genuinely did not know if they were going to throw her into some dark, rat-infested cell in the basement. She was the Queen of England, and she had to ask if she was going to a dungeon. Kingston's answer is one of those moments that makes you understand how truly twisted this situation was. He said, "No, madame, you shall go into the lodging you lay in at your coronation." Can you imagine? Can you actually imagine being told you're going back to the same room where you spent the happiest night of your life? But this time as a prisoner accused of crimes that carry the death penalty. Anne's response tells us everything about her state of mind. She said, "It is too good for me." Then she fell to her knees again, weeping, And in Kingston's own words, in the same sorrow fell into a great laughing, as she has done many times since. That is not movie drama. That is a real woman having a complete psychological break. Weeping, then laughing, then weeping again. Hysteria. Raw, uncontrolled panic. The kind of terror that makes your brain short-circuit because the reality is just too enormous to process. And where was she going? Let us talk about this room, because it matters. The Queen's lodgings at the Tower of London in 1536 were not some dusty medieval chambers. They were spectacular. Henry VIII had spent an absolute fortune renovating them specifically for Anne in 1533. We are talking about 6 rooms, 6 entire chambers designed for a queen. The Great Watching Chamber alone was 70 feet long and 30 feet wide. That is bigger than most people's entire houses today. Bigger than the King's own watching chamber, actually, which almost never happened. Henry wanted Anne to take centre stage. He wanted everyone to know, this woman is my queen. The walls were covered in painted friezes running along the top third of the room. The ceilings had elaborate moulded and painted fretwork. There were huge windows letting in light from the Thames. Soft furnishings, tapestries, everything designed to show wealth and power and royal favour. This was Anne's triumph, frozen in architecture. And now, in May 1536, those same rooms were her prison. Try to picture what that first night must have felt like. You walk into a space where 3 years ago, you were surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who adored you, courtiers trying to get your attention, musicians playing, servants bringing you delicacies from the kitchens. The room smelled like roses and expensive perfumes. The candles were made of pure beeswax, not tallow. Every single detail reminded you that you had won. You were queen. You had beaten all the odds. Now the room smells the same. The tapestries are the same. The view out the window is identical. The Thames flowing by, the ships, the sounds of London drifting through the glass. But you are not surrounded by friends. You are watched by 4 women who were specifically chosen because they do not like you. Let us talk about these women for a second, because this is important. There was Lady Kingston, the wife of the constable. Her job was basically to report everything to her husband, who reported everything to Cromwell. Then there was Mrs. Coffin, Margaret Coffin. She was the primary spy, the one Kingston specifically mentions as reporting conversations. Then there was Mrs. Stoner, another hostile presence. And finally, most cruel of all, there was Lady Boleyn. Now, historians have debated for centuries which Lady Boleyn this was. Most likely it was Anne's aunt, either Elizabeth or another aunt by marriage. Family. Actual family. And this woman was not there to comfort her niece. On that very first night, when Anne was spiralling, trying to figure out what was happening, she said to Kingston something like, "The king knew what he did when he put such 2 about me as my Lady Boleyn and Mistress Coffin, for they could tell her nothing of my lord her father, nor nothing else." She wanted news of her father. She wanted to know if her family was okay, if they were safe, if they knew what was happening. And Lady Boleyn's response? According to Kingston's letter, Lady Boleyn said, "Such desire as you have had to such tales has brought you to this." Read that again. "Such desire as you have had to such tales has brought you to this." Her own aunt basically saying this is your fault. You gossiped, you talked too much, you brought this on yourself. Can you imagine? You're imprisoned, terrified, and your own family member is standing there in your room telling you that you deserve this. Here is the really chilling part. These women did not just watch Anne during the day. They slept in her room. Mrs. Coffin and Lady Boleyn actually laid down on pallets, basically sleeping mats, right next to Anne's bed, every single night. and Kingston and his wife guarded the door so they could hear any conversations that happened inside. 24/7 surveillance. No privacy, not even in sleep. No moment to break down alone, no chance to think without being watched. No opportunity to even cry without someone taking notes for Cromwell. Anne was 35 years old. She had been queen for 3 years. She had given birth to the future Elizabeth I. She had changed the course of English history by refusing to be Henry's mistress, by demanding marriage, by triggering the English Reformation. She had intelligence, wit, education, charm. She had defeated Catherine of Aragon, the most powerful woman in Europe. And now she was sleeping in a gorgeous room, in a bed fit for a queen, surrounded by women who hated her, being watched like a criminal. That first night, May 2nd, 1536, Anne barely slept. How could you? Your mind would be racing. Who told them what? What exactly are they accusing me of? Where is my brother George? Is he safe? What about my father? What about my daughter Elizabeth? Oh God, Elizabeth. She is only 2.5 years old. Does she know anything? Will she remember me? What is Henry thinking? Can I write to him? Will he listen? Can I explain? This has to be a mistake. This has to be a misunderstanding. Henry loved me. He broke from Rome for me. He defied the entire Catholic Church. He risked his kingdom. Surely he will listen. Surely someone will tell him the truth. Surely this will be over soon. Surely, surely, surely. But in between those desperate thoughts, there had to be moments of clarity. Terrible, cold clarity. Because Anne Boleyn was not naive. She had lived at this court for over a decade. She had watched Henry VIII destroy people who got in his way. Cardinal Wolsey, once the most powerful man in England after the king, died broken and disgraced. Sir Thomas More, the king's good friend, brilliant scholar, Lord Chancellor, beheaded for refusing to accept the king as head of the church. Bishop John Fisher, executed for the same reason, and those were men. Powerful, connected men with resources and friends. Anne was a woman. She had made enemies, lots of enemies. The supporters of Catherine of Aragon hated her. The Catholics hated her. Even some of the reformers were not sure about her anymore. Her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, clearly was not on her side. And Thomas Cromwell, the man she had worked with, strategized with, the man who helped engineer her marriage, he was the one collecting these reports from Kingston. So yeah, maybe that first night lying in that beautiful bed, staring at the painted ceiling in the darkness, listening to the breathing of the women assigned to spy on her, maybe Anne started to understand this was not a misunderstanding. This was not going to be resolved with a conversation. This was something much bigger, much more dangerous. Kingston noted that she kept fluctuating between weeping and laughing. That is trauma. That is shock. Your brain literally cannot process the situation, so it bounces between emotional extremes, and Anne was smart enough to know exactly what was happening to her. She was being watched for a reason. They wanted her to talk, to say something incriminating, to give them ammunition, and you know what the saddest part is? She did talk. Over the next few days, she would ramble to these women about conversations she had had months ago with various men at court. Innocent conversations, probably. Flirtations, maybe. The kind of courtly banter that was completely normal in Henry's court. The kind of thing everyone did. But now, every word was being twisted, recorded, sent to Cromwell, and used to build a case against her. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are still on that first night. May 2nd, 1536. The room is dark except for whatever moonlight comes through the windows. The Thames is flowing outside just like it did 3 years ago. The tower's bells mark the hours, just like they always have. Somewhere in another part of the tower, her brother George is in his own cell. Somewhere at Greenwich Palace, little Elizabeth is probably asleep, unaware that her mother will never see her again. And Anne lies there in the Queen's bed in the Queen's room, wearing probably a simple nightgown, her dark hair loose, her eyes wide open in the darkness. And she tries to make sense of how she went from watching a tennis match this morning to being imprisoned for treason this evening. That is how fast it happened. One tennis match to total ruin in the span of hours. There is a detail that Kingston recorded that I find absolutely devastating. Anne asked him to move the King's Highness that she might have the sacrament, the Holy Communion, placed in the closet by her chamber so she could pray for mercy. And then she said, "For I am as clear from the company of man as for sin, as I am clear from you, and am the King's true wedded wife." She was asking for communion, the body and blood of Christ, the most sacred thing in Christianity, and she swore her innocence, swore it on the sacrament, on her soul. To a woman of deep faith, which Anne was, that was not a casual statement. You did not swear on the sacrament unless you were telling the absolute truth. Lying in that context was damning your soul to hell. She knew what she was saying. She knew the weight of those words, and she said them anyway because they were true. But here is the thing about truth. In May 1536, at the court of Henry VIII, with Thomas Cromwell pulling the strings, truth did not matter. What mattered was power. What mattered was who told the better story. What mattered was that Henry wanted a way out of this marriage, and now he had it. So Anne Boleyn spent that first night in a room built to celebrate her, surrounded by enemies, watched constantly, knowing that every word could be used against her, trying to hold on to some shred of hope while reality crept in through every beautiful familiar detail of that chamber. The room where queens wait, not for coronations, not for triumph, but for whatever comes next. And 3 years ago, what came next was glory. This time the waiting felt very different. Tomorrow never comes in this story, but we are not done yet. Because over the next 16 days, something extraordinary is going to happen in this room. Anne Boleyn is going to transform, not into someone different, but into something more. Into someone who understands that sometimes when everything is taken from you, all you have left is how you face the end. But that is a story for the next part of our journey. For now, let us leave Anne there in that first terrible night in the room where queens wait, and let us remember that history is not just about kings and battles and grand proclamations. Sometimes history is about a woman lying awake in the darkness, trying to make sense of how her world fell apart in a single afternoon. Rest well, everyone. More whispers from history are coming. So who were these women? The ones who slept in Anne's room, listened to her every word, reported her ramblings to men who would use them as evidence of treason? Let me tell you about them, because their identities matter. These were not random servants. These were not strangers. Every single one of them was chosen for a very specific reason. And if you have ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, or watched by someone who should have protected you, this part of the story is going to hit differently. First, there was Mary Scrope, Lady Kingston, wife of Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower. She was approximately 40 years old in 1536, a seasoned courtier, someone who had seen everything. And here is the important part. She had served Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, the woman Anne had replaced. Lady Kingston had been Catherine's lady-in-waiting, had watched Catherine be humiliated and cast aside, had probably comforted Catherine when Henry was pursuing Anne. And Lady Kingston was friends with Mary Tudor, Catherine's daughter, the princess Henry had declared illegitimate so he could marry Anne. Think about that for a second. The woman in charge of watching Anne Boleyn in the Tower was someone who had loved and served the woman Anne had destroyed to become queen. Can you imagine the level of resentment, the personal hatred. This was not about justice for Lady Kingston. This was personal. According to Sir William Kingston's letters to Thomas Cromwell, Lady Kingston slept outside Anne's bedchamber door, guarding it, listening, making sure nothing happened that was not reported. And when she was not there, the other women filled in the gaps. It was a relay system of surveillance perfectly designed to ensure that Anne was never, ever alone. Oh, and get this. After Anne's execution, after the whole nightmare was over, Lady Kingston went right back to serving the royal family. At the christening of Prince Edward, Jane Seymour's son, in October 1537, Lady Kingston carried Princess Mary's train, the same Mary whose mother Catherine had been humiliated and cast aside by Anne. It was like a final statement. The old order is back. The Boleyn interlude is over. Everything is as it should be. But Lady Kingston was not the only spy in that room. There was Margaret Coffin, or as Kingston called her in his letters, Mistress Cosin. She was married to Sir William Coffin, who was Anne's master of the horse. So technically, Margaret's husband worked for Anne. He was part of the Queen's household. But here is the thing about Tudor politics. Loyalty was flexible, very flexible, and when the wind changed direction, you changed with it, or you went down with the ship. Margaret Coffin was the primary Spiemel. Kingston straight up told Cromwell in his letters, "I have everything told me by Mistress Cosin that she thinks meet for me to know. Everything, every conversation, every moment of weakness, every rambling thought." Margaret Coffin was the one who slept on a pallet, basically a thin sleeping mat right next to Anne's bed. Can you picture that? You're trying to sleep, you are terrified, your mind is racing, and there is a woman lying 3 feet away from you, whose entire job is to remember everything you say so it can be used against you. And Margaret was good at her job, really good. Some historians think she might have even been the unnamed lady who was feeding information to Eustace Chapwys, the imperial ambassador who hated Anne with a passion. Chapwys wrote in a dispatch dated May 18th, 1536, that the lady who had charge of her has sent to tell me in great secrecy certain details about Anne's behaviour. If that was Margaret Coffin, she was not just spying for Cromwell, she was spying for foreign powers. After Anne's execution, Margaret did not miss a beat. She became a lady-in-waiting to Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, the one who replaced Anne. No consequences, no guilt, just a smooth transition from serving one queen to serving the next. Then there was Elizabeth Stoner. She is sometimes called Margaret in some records, but most historians agree it was Elizabeth Stoner, wife of Sir Walter Stoner, the King's Sergeant-at-Arms. Her title at court was Mother of the Maids, which sounds sweet, right? Like a kindly older woman taking care of the young ladies at court. But what it actually meant was that she was in charge of supervising the younger ladies-in-waiting, the maids of honour. It was a position of authority, of control. Elizabeth Stoner had served all of Henry's wives, all of them. She'd been there for Catherine of Aragon, then for Anne Boleyn when Anne was queen, and she would go on to serve Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. She was a survivor. The kind of woman who knew how to read the room, pick the winning side, and stay in favour no matter what. The historical record does not tell us much about what Elizabeth Stoner personally thought of Anne, but the fact that she was chosen for this assignment tells us something. She was reliable, trustworthy from Cromwell's perspective, not someone who would let sympathy get in the way of duty. Can you imagine spending your entire career serving these queens, watching them rise and fall and just continuing, moving from one household to the next like nothing happened? There is something almost chilling about that level of detachment. And finally, there was Lady Boleyn, Anne's own aunt. Now this one gets complicated because Anne had two aunts who were both called Lady Boleyn. One was Elizabeth Wood, married to Anne's uncle Sir James Boleyn. The other was Anne Tempest, married to another uncle, Edward Boleyn. Historians have argued for centuries about which one it was, but most modern scholarship points to Elizabeth Wood, Lady Boleyn, the wife of Sir James. Why does that matter? Because Sir James Boleyn was the Chancellor of Anne's own household. He was literally part of her team, part of her administration, and his wife was sleeping on the floor of Anne's prison cell, reporting her every word to the men trying to kill her. And here is the worst part. Here is the thing that makes this whole situation so unbearably cruel. On that very first night in the Tower, Anne complained to Kingston. She said, and this is a direct quote from Kingston's letter, "I think much unkindness in the king to put such about me as I never loved." She knew these women hated her. She knew they were not there to comfort her, and she specifically named two of them. The king knew what he did when he put such two about her as my Lady Boleyn and Mistress Coffin, for they could tell her nothing of my lord her father, nor nothing else. Anne wanted news. She wanted to know if her father was safe, if he knew what was happening, if there was any hope, and her own aunt and Margaret Coffin, they could have told her. They probably knew, but they refused. They gave her nothing. And then Lady Boleyn said something that I think is one of the cruelest lines in this entire story. When Anne complained about not getting news, Lady Boleyn replied, "Such desire as you have had to such tales has brought you to this." Read that again. "Such desire as you have had to such tales has brought you to this." Your own aunt, telling you that you deserve this, that your curiosity, your need for information, your talking too much has brought you to the Tower, to these charges, to certain death. It is victim blaming at its absolute finest, and it came from family. Now there is some debate among historians about exactly what Lady Boleyn meant by tales. Some think she was referring to gossip, to the fact that Anne was known for having a sharp tongue and being interested in court rumours. Others think she was referring to something Anne had said earlier about the men accused with her, some joke about how they might be able to write ballads even if they could not make their beds properly. Kingston's original letters were damaged in a fire in 1731, so we do not have perfect clarity on the context. But either way, the message was clear. You brought this on yourself, you deserve this, and I am not going to help you. These four women, Lady Kingston, Margaret Coffin, Elizabeth Stoner and Lady Boleyn, they surrounded Anne Boleyn every minute of every day for 17 days. Two of them slept in her room, literally at the foot of her bed. One slept outside the door. They watched her eat. They watched her pray. They watched her weep and laugh and ramble and try to make sense of what was happening. And everything went into the reports. Kingston wrote at least 5 letters to Cromwell during Anne's imprisonment, probably more that did not survive. And in those letters, he detailed everything the women told him. Anne talking about conversations she had had months ago with Henry Norris, one of the men accused with her. Anne speculating about why she was arrested. Anne wondering if Mark Smeaton, the musician who had confessed to adultery with her, had been tortured. Anne talking about Sir Francis Weston, and a conversation where she had teased him about loving Madge Shelton more than his own wife. All of it. Every random thought, every nervous rambling, every desperate attempt to understand what was happening. All of it was written down and sent to the man building the case for her execution. You know what is really twisted? Anne probably thought that if she just explained herself, if she just talked through what had actually happened, someone would understand, someone would realize this was all a terrible mistake. So she talked. She kept talking, trying to remember conversations, trying to explain context, trying to demonstrate her innocence, and every word became evidence. Historians today read Kingston's letters and see proof of Anne's innocence. We can see that she is just talking, just trying to make sense of Totson's accusations. We can see the panic, the confusion, the desperate attempt to figure out what she is being accused of. But in 1536, with Cromwell reading those letters, looking for anything he could use, those same words became proof of guilt. Oh, she remembers a conversation with Henry Norris. Clearly there was something inappropriate going on. She joked with Francis Weston. Obviously, she was having an affair. She talked to these men at all. Well, there you go. Adultery. It is the perfect Kafkaesque nightmare. You're accused of a crime you did not commit. You try to defend yourself by explaining what actually happened. Your explanation is then used as proof that you are guilty. You cannot win. There is no winning move. And the women in that room, they were the engine that made it all work. Without them, there would have been no evidence. Without them, Cromwell would have had a much harder time building his case. Mark Smeaton had confessed under torture, but he was just a musician, low-born. His testimony alone would not have been enough to convict a queen. But Anne's own words, reported by respectable women, including her own aunt, that was gold. Here is a question I want you to think about. Do you think these women felt guilty? Do you think Lady Kingston ever thought about Catherine of Aragon and wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was letting personal resentment cloud her judgment? Do you think Margaret Coffin ever looked at Anne sleeping and thought, this woman is innocent and I am helping to kill her? Do you think Lady Boleyn ever had a moment of family loyalty kick in? We will never know. There is no record of any of them expressing regret. They all went on with their lives. Lady Kingston served at Prince Edward's christening. Margaret Coffin served Jane Seymour. Elizabeth Stoner kept her position as mother of the maids. Life went on. But I want you to imagine being Anne Boleyn for just a moment. You are 35 years old. You have been Queen of England for 3 years. You have given birth to the future Elizabeth I. You have survived court politics, religious upheaval, the hatred of half the country, and the temperamental moods of one of history's most difficult men. And now you're in a beautiful room that used to represent your triumph, surrounded by women who hate you, watched every second of every day, knowing that every word you say might be twisted into evidence that will end your life. You cannot trust anyone. Your own family is working against you. The women sleeping in your room are there to destroy you. You have no privacy, no comfort, no allies. How do you survive that? How do you keep your sanity? The answer is you do not, really. Kingston's letters make it very clear that Anne was not okay. She wept, then laughed, then wept again. She swung between hope and despair. She talked compulsively, trying to work through the nightmare logically, as if logic had anything to do with what was happening to her. This was not a trial. This was an execution dressed up as justice, and these 4 women, whether they understood it or not, whether they felt good about it or not, were absolutely critical to making it happen. The surveillance state, the lack of privacy, the weaponization of everyday conversation, the betrayal by people who should have protected you. This all happened in 1536, but does it not sound kind of familiar? Does it not echo things we still deal with today? The feeling of being watched, of having your words taken out of context, of being judged by people who have already decided you are guilty. Anne Boleyn experienced something that in a weird way feels almost modern. Total surveillance, zero privacy. Guilty until proven innocent, except there is no way to prove innocence because the game is rigged. And it all happened in a beautiful room with expensive tapestries on the walls and soft candlelight and the sound of the Thames flowing by outside. Sometimes horror does not look like a dungeon. Sometimes it looks like luxury. Sometimes it looks like 4 women doing their jobs. So the next time you feel like someone is watching you, or your words are being twisted, or the people around you are not who they pretend to be, remember Anne Boleyn in May 1536. Remember that she faced the absolute extreme version of that feeling, and remember that she survived it, at least for 17 days, with more dignity than most of us could manage. But we are not done with her story yet, because what happened next, in the days that followed that first terrible night, is almost more remarkable than her arrival. Anne Boleyn was about to do something extraordinary, not by escaping, not by being rescued, but by transforming the way she understood her situation, and ultimately the way she faced her death. That transformation is coming. But for now, let us sit with this. 4 women, 1 prisoner, 17 days, and every word recorded for history. Sleep well, everyone. There is more of this whispered story waiting for you. 4 days into her imprisonment on May 6, 1536, Anne Boleyn did something that would haunt history for nearly 500 years. She wrote a letter to her husband. Or more accurately, she dictated a letter, because prisoners accused of high treason were not exactly given free access to pen and paper. But here is the thing that will break your heart. The letter never reached Henry VIII. It was found 4 years later in 1540 among Thomas Cromwell's personal papers, after he was executed. The same Thomas Cromwell who orchestrated Anne's downfall was executed by the same king, in the same manner at the same tower. History has a dark sense of irony sometimes. Let me tell you about this letter, because it might be the most devastating piece of evidence we have about what Anne was actually thinking, feeling, and experiencing in those final days. First, a quick question for anyone who has ever sent an important message that never got a response. Have you ever texted someone something important and just watched the 3 dots appear and disappear? Or sent an email that really mattered and never heard back? That feeling of sending your words into the void, not knowing if they were read, if they were understood, if they even arrived. Now imagine that feeling, but the message is your life, and the silence means death. That is what happened to Anne Boleyn. The letter, as it exists today, is not in Anne's handwriting. That has led some historians to claim it as a forgery, that Anne never wrote it at all. But hold on, because we actually know from Kingston's reports to Cromwell that Anne did ask to write to the king. It is right there in the historical record. And the fact that it is not in her handwriting means nothing. Do you know how letters worked in 1536 for imprisoned queens accused of treason? You did not get to write your own letter. Obviously, you might use it to send secret messages, write something seditious, plot your escape, so you dictated. A scribe that Cromwell trusted would write down your words, or at least write down what he wanted your words to be. That is how it worked. So the fact that it is not Anne's handwriting actually makes it more believable, not less. And here is the really interesting part. Multiple historians from the 1600s and 1700s, people like Lord Herbert of Cherbury, John Strype, Gilbert Burnet, they all saw this letter and wrote about it. Some of them claim to have seen what they believed was the original. The letter has a provenance, a paper trail stretching back centuries. It was found alongside Kingston's 5 letters to Cromwell, the ones we've been talking about, the ones that detailed Anne's every word and action. Why would those be kept together if the letter was fake? Why would Cromwell have a forged letter sitting with genuine official correspondence? Most modern historians who have studied this letter deeply, people like Sandra Vasoli, who literally spent 8 months researching nothing but this one document, believe it is authentic, that Anne Boleyn did write these words, or dictated them, and that they represent her last recorded attempt to communicate with a man who was about to kill her. So what did the letter say? It starts like this. Sir, your grace's displeasure and my imprisonment are things so strange unto me, as what to write or what to excuse, I am altogether ignorant. Right out of the gate, Anne is confused. She does not understand why this is happening. She does not know what she is supposed to be defending herself against. And think about that. 4 days into imprisonment, after being watched constantly, after having her every word reported to Cromwell, Anne still does not fully understand the charges. She knows she is accused of adultery with 3 men, maybe more at this point, but the specifics, the evidence, the actual accusations, nobody's telling her anything. Then she writes something really clever. She says that Henry sent a messenger to her, asking her to confess the truth and obtain his favour, but the messenger was such a one whom you know to be my ancient and professed enemy. We do not know exactly who this messenger was, but the point is clear. Henry, you sent someone who hates me to tell me to confess? How am I supposed to trust that? How am I supposed to believe this is a genuine offer of mercy when you sent my enemy to deliver it? She is smart. Even in desperation, even in terror, Anne Boleyn is politically astute. She understands the game being played, and she is calling it out. Then comes the part that makes me want to reach back through time and give this woman a hug. She writes, "But let not your grace ever imagine that your poor wife will ever be brought to acknowledge a fault, where not so much as thought thereof proceeded." Read that slowly. Not so much as thought thereof proceeded. She is not just saying she did not commit adultery. She is saying the thought never even crossed her mind, not for a second, not even as a passing fantasy, never. And then she says this, and oh my God, this line, "And to speak a truth, never. Prince had wife more loyal in all duty, and in all true affection, than you have found in Anne Boleyn." Anne Boleyn, not Anne the Queen, not Her Majesty, Anne Boleyn. She signs the letter at the end the same way, "Your most loyal and ever faithful wife, Anne Boleyn." Some historians think this is significant, that she is reminding Henry of the woman he fell in love with, not the queen who failed to give him a son. The girl from a respectable but not overly noble family who captured his heart for 7 years, Anne Boleyn, the name she had before all of this, the woman, not the crown. The letter continues and it gets even more heartbreaking. She talks about her marriage to Henry and she says something that I think shows she understood exactly what was happening. She writes that she always knew her position was built on nothing more solid than the king's fancy, that from the moment he raised her from a low estate to be his queen, she knew it could all disappear just as quickly, because her preferment was based on Henry's affection, and affection, as we all know, can change. She knew. From the beginning she knew this could happen. Maybe not the charges of adultery and treason, but the fall from favour. The sudden rejection. She had watched it happen to Catherine of Aragon. She had been the other woman while Catherine was cast aside. Did Anne lie awake some nights, when things were good, and wonder if someday another woman would do the same to her? Probably. And then she basically accuses Henry of orchestrating the whole thing. Not in so many words, because that would get her killed even faster, but she writes, "If then you found me worthy of such honour, good your grace, let not any light fancy, or bad counsel of mine enemies withdraw your princely favour from me." Light fancy. She is talking about Jane Seymour, Henry's new love interest, the quiet, demure lady-in-waiting who was everything Anne was not. Anne knows. Of course she knows. The whole court knows. Henry has already settled his affection on Jane. Anne even writes, later in the letter, "Follow your affection already settled on that party, for whose sake I am now as I am. For whose sake I am now as I am." Because of Jane Seymour, Anne Boleyn is in the Tower. That is what she is saying. And she is right. Henry wanted Jane. He wanted a fresh start. He wanted a wife who would be obedient and give him sons and not argue with him about politics or religion or anything else. And the fastest way to get Jane was to get rid of Anne. So here we are. The most powerful part of the letter, in my opinion, is when Anne talks about the other men arrested with her and writes, "My last and only request shall be, that myself may only bear the burthen of your grace's displeasure, and that it may not touch the innocent souls of those poor gentlemen, who, as I understand, are likewise in strait imprisonment for my sake." For my sake. She knows these men are in prison because of her. She knows they're going to die because they are accused of being her lovers, and she is begging Henry to spare them. Not herself. Them. The letter is not, "Please do not kill me." The letter is, "Please do not kill them." That tells you something about Anne Boleyn's character. Even at the end, even when her own life is on the line, she is thinking about the innocent men who are caught up in this nightmare because of her. Henry Norris, who swore she was innocent. Francis Weston, who was only 25 years old with a wife and child. William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and her own brother George. She is begging for their lives. And then she ends with this: "If ever I have found favour in your sight, if ever the name of Anne Boleyn hath been pleasing to your ears, then let me obtain this request." She is appealing to their history, to the 7 years he pursued her, to the break with Rome, to the creation of the Church of England, to their daughter Elizabeth, to everything they had been to each other. "Please," she is saying, "if I ever meant anything to you, if you ever loved me even a little bit, please spare these men." The letter was dated May 6th, 1536, from her doleful prison the Tower, and it was inscribed at the top, probably by Cromwell, "To the King from the Lady in the Tower, the Lady in the Tower." Not the Queen, not Anne Boleyn, just the Lady in the Tower. So why did Cromwell keep it? Why did he not deliver it to Henry? Here is the thing, we will never know for sure, but most historians think Cromwell made a calculated decision. If Henry read this letter, there was a chance, maybe a small one, but a chance that his conscience would kick in, that he would remember the Anne Boleyn he had loved, that he would start questioning the charges, that he would hesitate. And Cromwell could not afford for Henry to hesitate. The whole plan, the entire carefully constructed case depended on momentum, on moving fast before anyone could think too hard about how absurd the charges were, on executing the men first so that by the time Anne was tried, there would already be evidence from their confessions, even though most of them maintained their innocence to the end. If Henry wavered, if he showed mercy, the whole thing could fall apart. And Cromwell, who had been the one to suggest reforming the monasteries and had promised Henry that the proceeds would fill the royal coffers, who had been working closely with Anne on religious reform until they fell out, Cromwell needed Anne gone, for political reasons, for personal reasons, for all the complicated reasons that Tudor court politics created. So he kept the letter, tucked it away with Kingston's reports. Maybe he thought, someday, when this is all over and Anne is dead and Jane Seymour is queen and Henry has his male heir and everything is settled, maybe then he could destroy it, or maybe he kept it as insurance, as proof if anyone ever questioned what happened, that he had been following orders, that he had documentation that he was just doing his job. But Cromwell never got that someday, because in 1540 Henry turned on him too, accused him of treason, sent him to the Tower, executed him, and when Cromwell's belongings were searched, someone found the letter, along with Kingston's reports, and kept them, preserved them. Eventually they made their way to Sir Robert Cotton, a collector of historical documents, and then to the British Library, where they remain today. If you ever go to London, you can go to the British Library and request to see these documents. You can hold in your hands, or at least view through protective glass, the words that Anne Boleyn spoke on May 6, 1536, trying to save the lives of innocent men, and maybe, just maybe, hoping that the man she had loved for so long would remember that love and show mercy. But Henry never read it, or if he did, he threw it aside without a second thought. We do not know which. All we know is that 11 days after Anne wrote that letter, the 5 men were executed. 2 days after that, Anne herself was dead. What would have happened if Henry had read the letter? What if Cromwell had delivered it? What if Henry had seen Anne's words, her plea for the innocent men, her reminder of their shared history, her declaration of loyalty and love? Would it have changed anything? Probably not. Henry VIII was not a man known for his mercy or his change of heart. Once he decided something, he barreled forward. But we will never know. Because the letter sat in Cromwell's papers, unread, while Anne Boleyn waited in the Tower for a response that never came. Do you ever think about the things we do not say to people? The letters we do not send? The texts we delete before hitting send? The conversations we never have because we are scared or proud or convinced it would not matter anyway? Anne Boleyn said everything. She laid her heart bare. She appealed to love, to memory, to conscience, to mercy, and the words never even made it to the person they were intended for. There is something so deeply, universally human about that. About trying to communicate with someone who cannot or will not hear you. About sending your truth into the void and getting only silence in return. Anne Boleyn experienced that in the most extreme way possible. But the feeling, the desperation of needing to be heard and not being able to reach the person who matters, that is something we can all understand, that transcends centuries, that connects us to her across the vast gulf of time. The letter exists. We have it. Historians have studied it, debated it, analysed every word, but the person it was written for never saw it. And that might be the saddest part of this entire tragedy. In a few days, Anne would stop trying to communicate with Henry. She would stop hoping for mercy or understanding or a fair trial. She would stop believing that the truth mattered, because when your words cannot reach the person with the power to save you, and when every other word you speak is twisted into evidence against you, what is left? Only one thing. The realization that this is not about truth or justice or even guilt or innocence. This is about power. And once you understand that, once you truly accept it, something shifts, something changes, not in your circumstances, but in you. Anne Boleyn was about to undergo that shift, that transformation. And what she became in those final days is something we're going to explore together. But first, she had to let go of hope. She had to stop believing that explaining herself would save her. She had to accept that the letter would not work, the truth would not matter, and Henry was never going to remember the woman he had loved. That is where we are going next. To the moment when Anne stopped fighting and started transforming, when she let go of everything except her dignity, her faith and her determination to face the end with grace. But for now, let us sit with this letter, these words, this last desperate attempt to reach a man who had already decided she did not matter anymore. Let us honour the fact that she tried, that she spoke her truth even when it could not save her. And let us remember that 500 years later we are reading her words, we hear her, even if Henry never did. Between May 3rd and May 19th, 1536, Sir William Kingston wrote at least 5 letters to Thomas Cromwell, probably more that have not survived. These letters contain some of the most intimate, heartbreaking, and ultimately damning documentation of a woman's psychological breakdown that exists in Tudor history. Every word Anne spoke, every gesture, every moment of weakness, all of it went into these reports. And here is the twisted thing. Those same reports that Cromwell used to build the case for Anne's execution are the exact same documents that modern historians use to prove her innocence. Let me show you how words can be weapons, how truth can be manipulated, How a woman trying to defend herself became her own accuser simply by speaking. Kingston's first report, dated May the 3rd, the day after Anne arrived at the tower, contains this line: "She kneeled down, weeping good pace, and in the same sorrow fell into a great laughing, as she has done many times since." Weeping, then laughing, laughing, then weeping, over and over again. Kingston noted it because it was strange, unsettling, not normal behaviour for a queen, but you know what it actually is? Textbook trauma response. When your brain cannot process the enormity of what is happening, when reality becomes too overwhelming to handle in a linear, logical way, your emotions short-circuit. You swing wildly between extremes. One minute you are sobbing because you understand you're probably going to die. The next minute you're laughing because the whole situation is so absurd, so surreal, that laughter is the only response that makes sense. It is not mockery, it is not irony, it is not some kind of witchy behaviour or proof of guilt. It is a 35-year-old woman having a complete psychological breakdown in real time. But how do you think Cromwell read that line? How do you think it sounded to the men building the case against her? Weeping and laughing, unstable, hysterical, not to be trusted. Guilty conscience, perhaps? A woman who knows she is caught and cannot maintain her composure? Same facts. Completely different interpretation depending on who is reading and what they want to believe. Here is another line from Kingston's first report, and this one is absolutely devastating. Anne says to him, "I hear say that I should be accused with 3 men, and I can say no more but nay without I should open my body." And then, according to Kingston, she opened her gown. Think about what she is saying. She is accused of adultery with 3 men. The only way to prove she has not been with these men would be to open her body, to show them somehow that she is innocent. It is almost like she is saying, "What do you want from me? How can I prove something did not happen? Do you want to examine me physically? Would that convince you?" And she opens her gown, not in some seductive way, not as a display, but as a desperate, frustrated gesture. Prove it to me and show me how I prove a negative. How do I demonstrate that something never occurred? Have you ever been accused of something you did not do and found yourself in that impossible position? Where the accusation itself is the evidence, and anything you say to defend yourself just sounds like more guilt. That is where Anne is. That gesture opening her gown was not an admission. It was desperation made physical. But it went into Kingston's report, and you can bet Cromwell made note of it. Strange behaviour. Inappropriate. Not how an innocent queen would act. Another mark against her. Then Anne starts talking about the men who are imprisoned with her. She says, "O Norris, hast thou accused me? Thou art in the tower with me, and thou and I shall die together. And mark, thou art here too." She knows they are in the tower. She knows they are accused along with her. And she is trying to work out in real time who said what. Did Norris accuse her? Did Mark Smeaton confess to something that never happened? She is doing what any of us would do in that situation. She is trying to piece together the logic of the accusation, trying to figure out where it came from, what was said, what was twisted, and every single word of her trying to figure it out went into Kingston's reports and became evidence that she was thinking about these men, talking about these men. Clearly there must have been something going on with these men. It is a perfect trap. Defend yourself? You are thinking about them too much, which means you are guilty. Do not defend yourself. Your silence is admission of guilt. There is no winning move. Then Anne says something that breaks my heart every time I read it. She says, "O my mother, thou wilt die with sorrow." Her mother, Elizabeth Boleyn, wife of Thomas Boleyn, mother of Anne, George and Mary. Anne knows what this is going to do to her mother. She knows that her mother will have to watch her daughter and her son be accused of incest and executed as traitors. Can you imagine your two children accused of sleeping with each other, both sentenced to death? What does that do to a mother? Anne is not thinking about herself in that moment. She is thinking about her mother's grief. And that line went into Kingston's report. Just a detail. Just one more rambling comment from the hysterical queen in the tower. Kingston writes that Anne also much lamented my Lady of Worcester, for by cause that her child did not stir in her body. Lady Worcester, Elizabeth Brown, Countess of Worcester, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, and according to some accounts, one of the women whose testimony helped trigger the entire investigation. There are reports that Lady Worcester's brother had confronted her about an affair she was having, and in defending herself she said something like, "I am no worse than the Queen." And that comment, that one defensive comment, may have started the whole catastrophic chain of events. Lady Worcester was pregnant at the time Anne was arrested, and Anne in the tower is worried about her. The baby is not moving. Lady Worcester must be terrified, stressed, grief-stricken, and Anne, facing her own death, is concerned for this woman's unborn child. That is not the behaviour of a guilty person. That is not the thought process of a scheming adulteress. That is a woman with empathy, with compassion, with a conscience. But it went into the report, and Cromwell filed it away. Here is one of the most famous lines from Kingston's reports, and it shows you just how sharp Anne's mind still was, even in the midst of terror. Kingston tells Anne that the poorest subject the king hath justice. This is him trying to reassure her. Even the poorest person in England gets a fair trial. The king is just, the law is fair, you will have justice. And Anne laughed. Kingston notes it specifically, and therewith she laughed. Why did she laugh? Because she knew it was a lie. She knew that justice had nothing to do with what was happening to her. She had watched Thomas More be executed for refusing to acknowledge the king as head of the church. She had watched Cardinal Wolsey be destroyed for failing to secure Henry's divorce from Catherine. She had seen how justice worked when you were on the wrong side of the king's will. The poorest subject has justice? Maybe. But queens who fail to produce male heirs, queens who argue with the king, queens who have enemies at court and have fallen out of favour, what kind of justice do they get? She laughed because it was absurd, and that laugh went into Kingston's report. Further proof, if you were looking for it, that Anne Boleyn was not taking this seriously, that she was mocking the process, that she was guilty and knew it. But if you read it differently, if you read it as a woman who understands exactly what is happening and has no illusions left about fairness or justice, that laugh is one of the most honest things in the entire historical record. Over the next few days, Anne kept talking. She talked about conversations she had had with Henry Norris. She talked about teasing Francis Weston about being in love with Madge Shelton instead of his own wife. She talked about the men accused with her, trying to remember what had been said, when, in front of whom. And every word went into the reports. Every memory, every attempt to explain context, every desperate try at making sense of nonsense charges, all of it was recorded by the women spies, passed to Lady Kingston, passed to Kingston himself and sent to Cromwell. Do you know what the really horrifying part is? Anne probably thought she was helping herself. She probably thought, if I can just explain what really happened, if I can just provide context for these conversations, then they will see there was nothing inappropriate. They will understand. She had faith in truth. She believed that if she could just articulate the reality of the situation, someone would listen. But truth does not matter when the verdict is already decided. Truth does not matter when the person reading your words is looking for evidence to kill you, not evidence to save you. Modern historians read Kingston's reports and see a frightened, innocent woman desperately trying to make sense of false accusations. We see the inconsistencies in the charges. We see that the dates do not match up, that some of the alleged affairs supposedly happened when Anne was pregnant, or when the men were not even at court. We see that the only confession came from Mark Smeaton, who was tortured and was lowborn and terrified. But Cromwell in 1536, he read those same reports and saw a queen who thought about these men too much, who remembered conversations in too much detail, who was too familiar with her male courtiers, who could not control her emotions, who laughed when she should have wept and wept when she should have been composed. Same information, opposite conclusions. That is how dangerous words can be when the reader has already decided what they want to find. Here is something Kingston noted that I think shows just how calculated this whole thing was. He wrote to Cromwell that he had been very careful about what he said to Anne, that he tried not to tell her too much, that he gave her just enough information to keep her talking, but not so much that she would stop. It is interrogation technique. You create an information vacuum. The person fills it by talking. They volunteer information because they are desperate to understand what is happening, and everything they volunteer can be used against them. Kingston was good at his job. He had been Constable of the Tower for 12 years by this point. He had held some of the most important prisoners in England. He knew how to extract information, and he knew how to present that information in a way that served his purposes, and more importantly, Cromwell's purposes. Was Kingston cruel? I do not think so. There is actually some evidence that he pitied Anne, that he was disturbed by what he was participating in. But pity does not stop you from doing your job. Pity does not make you rebel against the system. Kingston did what he was told. He watched, he listened, he recorded, and he reported. And Anne kept talking. There is one report, I cannot remember which one, because the originals were damaged in a fire in 1731 and parts are illegible. But there is a moment where Anne asks Kingston about her father. Where is he? Is he safe? Does he know what is happening? Kingston does not tell her that her father, Thomas Boleyn, has been stripped of his position as Lord Privy Seal, that he has lost all influence at court, that he is staying away from London entirely, either out of fear or shame or political calculation. Kingston just gives her vague reassurance and changes the subject. Information control. Keep the prisoner isolated. Keep them uncertain. Keep them talking because they're trying to fill in the gaps of what they do not know. It is psychological warfare. It is not torture in the traditional sense. Nobody is physically hurting Anne, but they are systematically breaking down her mental state by controlling information, controlling her environment, controlling every single aspect of her existence for 17 days. And they are writing it all down, creating a record that will survive 500 years, a record that we can read today and argue about and analyze and use to try to understand what really happened in May 1536. The irony is beautiful in a terrible way. Cromwell wanted these reports to build a case for execution. He wanted evidence of guilt. He wanted Anne's own words to condemn her, and he got that. The reports were used. The men were executed on May 17th. Anne was executed on May 19th. Cromwell succeeded completely. But those same reports are why we know with near certainty that Anne Boleyn was innocent. Because when you read them without looking for guilt, when you read them as documents of a terrified woman trying to survive an impossible situation, they are exonerating. They show panic, not calculation, confusion, not conspiracy, innocence desperately trying to prove itself with no idea that the proof does not matter. Kingston's reports sealed Anne's fate in 1536, but they also secured her legacy in a way Cromwell never intended. They preserved her voice, her words, her humanity. They turned her from a name in a history book into a real person we can still hear speaking 5 centuries later. That is power. Not the power she had as queen, not the power Henry gave her when he made her his wife, but the power of words surviving the people who tried to use them as weapons. The power of truth outlasting the lies built around it. The power of a woman's voice refusing to be silenced even after death. Kingston died in September 1540, only a few months after Anne. And you know what? History barely remembers him except as the man who wrote these letters. He is a footnote, a record keeper, the guy who took notes. But Anne Boleyn is immortal. Controversial, yes, debated absolutely, but immortal. I wonder if Kingston ever thought about that. In his final days, did he think about the queen he'd watched die? Did he read over his own reports and wonder what they really proved? Did he feel any guilt, any regret, any sense that maybe, just maybe, he had been part of something unjust? We will never know, because Kingston, unlike Anne, did not have 4 women recording his every word. His inner thoughts died with him. But Anne's words live on, in reports meant to destroy her, in letters that never reached their destination, in scaffold speeches that witnesses recorded and passed down through generations. Words are powerful, never forget that. They can be twisted, yes. Manipulated, definitely. Used as weapons, absolutely. But they can also survive. They can outlast the people who tried to control them. They can tell the truth long after everyone involved is dead. Anne Boleyn knew that, I think. In those final days, when she stopped trying to defend herself and started preparing to die with dignity, I think she understood that her words would outlive her accusations, that history would have the final say. Not Cromwell, not Henry, not the men who condemned her. And she was right. But we are not at the final days yet. We are still in the middle, in those long, terrible days when she was still talking, still hoping, still believing that maybe, somehow, the truth would matter. Soon that would change. Soon Anne would stop talking and start transforming. But first she had to watch her brother and the other men die. She had to witness the destruction of everyone accused with her. She had to understand fully and finally that this was not about truth or justice or anything remotely fair. That moment is coming, the moment when everything shifts, when Anne Boleyn stops being a prisoner hoping for mercy and becomes something else entirely, something that even her enemies would have to respect, even if they would not admit it. We are almost there. Stay with me. Night falls differently when you know you're going to die. The darkness is not restful. It is a countdown. Every hour that passes is 1 hour closer to the end. Every sound outside your window might be the carpenters building your scaffold. Every footstep in the corridor might be Kingston coming to tell you that it's time. Anne Boleyn spent 17 nights in the Tower of London. From what we can piece together from the historical record, she barely slept through any of them. On her final night, the night of May 18th into May 19th, we know for certain she did not sleep at all. She was awake all night, praying, preparing, waiting for dawn. But even before that last terrible night, sleep must have been nearly impossible. How do you rest when your mind will not stop racing? When every time you close your eyes, you see the faces of the people you love who you will never see again? Let me tell you about those nights, the ones history does not talk about much. The long, dark, quiet hours when Anne was alone with her thoughts, her fear and her God. Picture this, it is maybe the 3rd or 4th night in the tower. You've been crying on and off all day, your mind is exhausted from trying to make sense of the charges. Your body is tired from the constant adrenaline, the fear, the hypervigilance of knowing you are being watched every second. You should be able to sleep, you desperately need to sleep, but you cannot. Because the moment you lie down, the moment it gets quiet, your brain starts working overtime. Where is Elizabeth? Is she safe? Does she know what is happening? Will anyone take care of her? What about your mother? Your father? "Oh God, your brother George, is he really in the tower too? What are they accusing him of? How did this happen? What did you do wrong? What could you have done differently? If you'd just given Henry a son, if you'd just kept your mouth shut about politics, if you had just been more careful about who you talked to, who you laughed with, who you trusted, round and round and round it goes." The same thoughts over and over, and sleep is impossible. The historical record tells us that Anne requested something very specific on her first night in the tower. She asked Kingston to petition the king so she could have the Blessed Sacrament placed in a closet in her chamber. The sacrament, the consecrated host, the body of Christ according to Catholic belief. She wanted it near her so she could pray. This is not a casual request. This is a woman reaching for the deepest source of comfort she knows. For a devout Christian in 1536, having the sacrament in your room was like having a direct line to God. It was the most holy thing you could access. And Anne wanted it close because she needed something, anything that felt sacred and safe in a situation that was profane and terrifying. Kingston reported this request to Cromwell. Of course he did. Everything got reported, and the request tells us something crucial about Anne's state of mind. She was turning to faith, not because she thought God would perform a miracle and save her, but because faith was the only thing that could not be taken away from her. Henry could take her crown. Cromwell could take her freedom. The court could take her reputation. Death could take her life. But her soul, her relationship with God, that was hers alone. So she prayed, hour after hour, night after night. In a beautiful room that felt like a prison, with women sleeping at her feet who hated her, Anne Boleyn prayed. Have you ever had a night like that? Where sleep will not come, and all you can do is turn to something bigger than yourself. Whether that is prayer or meditation or just lying there hoping that somehow the universe will make sense. Where you bargain with God or fate or whatever you believe in. Please just let me get through this. Please let the people I love be okay. Please let there be some meaning in this suffering. Anne was human. She did all of that. We know she did because Kingston's reports mention her talking about God constantly, about her innocence before, about her soul, about mercy. She was having a spiritual crisis in real time, and the only witnesses were women paid to use it against her. Fast forward to May 17th. That is the day the 5 men were executed. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and her brother George. All 5 beheaded on Tower Hill that morning. Anne would not have been able to see the executions from the Queen's apartments. The windows faced the wrong direction, but she would have known. Somebody would have told her. Or maybe she just knew from the silence, from the atmosphere, from the way the women around her moved and whispered. 5 men dead, including her brother. The brother she grew up with, the brother who had been at court with her, who had been part of her household, who had defended her when no one else would, George Boleyn, accused of incest with his own sister. An accusation so vile, so absurd that even the people who hated Anne found it hard to believe. But he was dead now, executed as a traitor. How do you sleep that night? The night your brother dies for a crime he did not commit, accused of something so horrific that his name would be stained forever. How do you close your eyes and rest when you know that tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, you are going to follow him to the scaffold? You do not sleep, you pray, and that is exactly what Anne did. On the night of May 17th into May 18th, Anne believed she was going to die at 9 a.m. on the 18th. So at 2 a.m., still dark outside, she called for her almoner. His name was John Skip. Some accounts say it might have been another chaplain named Thirlwell, but most historians agree it was Skip. He was her personal chaplain, the man who said mass for her household, who heard confessions, who provided spiritual guidance. At 2 a.m. he came to pray with her. Can you imagine? 2 o'clock in the morning, the Queen of England about to die in a few hours, kneeling into prayer with her chaplain. What do you pray about in that moment? Do you ask for strength, for forgiveness, for Elizabeth, for the truth to somehow, someday be known? Do you pray for your soul, for peace, for the courage to face what is coming? We do not know what Anne prayed that night. Those prayers were between her and God, but we know she was still praying when Archbishop Thomas Cranmer arrived just after dawn. Cranmer, one of the few people at court who had genuinely supported her, who had been part of the religious reform she championed, who probably did not believe she was guilty but could not save her. He came to hear her final confession and to celebrate Mass. And here is where it gets really important. Anne asked for Kingston to be present. She specifically requested that the Constable of the Tower, the man who'd been reporting her every word to Cromwell, be in the room while she took the sacrament. And then, in front of Kingston, she swore, twice, before and after receiving communion, that she had never been unfaithful to the king. Think about what that means. In Catholic theology, taking the sacrament while in a state of mortal sin damns your soul to hell. If Anne was lying, if she actually had committed adultery and was swearing her innocence while receiving the body of Christ, she was condemning herself to eternal damnation. That is not a risk you take lightly if you actually believe in God, which Anne clearly did. She swore on her salvation, on her eternal soul, that she was innocent, and she did it in front of Kingston so he could report it back to Cromwell and, hopefully, to Henry. It was her final act of legal defence, not in a courtroom, not through a lawyer, but before God and with the witness who would have to tell the king. Did it matter? No, Kingston reported it. Henry did not care. The execution was still scheduled. But it matters to us now, because it is one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have that Anne Boleyn was telling the truth. After Mass, after swearing her innocence on the sacrament, Anne waited. She thought she was going to die at 9 a.m, but 9 a.m. came and went, and nobody came to get her. The execution had been postponed, again, until noon, they said, then until the next day. Do you know what that does to a person psychologically? You have spent the night preparing to die, you have prayed for hours, you have made your peace with God, you have confessed everything you can think of, you are ready, not happy about it, not eager for it, but ready, resigned, accepting, and then they delay it, and you have to wait, and prepare all over again, and the fear and anticipation rebuild, and you have to live through another night, another set of dark hours, another round of maybe this is the last time I see the sun set. It is torture, unintentional maybe. The delays were probably logistical. The swordsman from Calais was late, the scaffold was not ready, they needed to clear foreigners out of the tower. Practical reasons, but the effect on Anne must have been devastating. Kingston noted her reaction. He said she took the news of the delay with composure, but he also noted that she said something that just breaks my heart. She said, "I hear say I shall not die before noon, and I am very sorry therefore, for I thought to be dead and past my pain." Read that again. I thought to be dead and past my pain. She wanted it to be over. The waiting was worse than the dying. The anticipation, the uncertainty, the constant fear, she was ready to be past it, and they made her wait. Kingston tried to comfort her. He said the blow would be quick, that there would be no pain, that the swordsman was skilled, and Anne, with that dark humour that seemed to define her final days, said the line that has echoed through history. "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." And then she put her hands around her throat and laughed. What do you do with that? Is it bravery? Is it breaking? Is it a coping mechanism, finding humour in horror? I think it is all of those things. I think Anne Boleyn was holding herself together with prayer, with dark jokes, with sheer force of will, and underneath it all was exhaustion. Soul-deep, bone-tired exhaustion. Not just from lack of sleep, though that was real, but from carrying the weight of this nightmare for 17 days. 17 nights. Some of them spent weeping, some spent talking compulsively to the women, trying to make sense of the charges, some spent in prayer, some staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move across the painted fretwork, listening to the Thames flow by outside, thinking about Elizabeth, about her mother, about George, about all the futures that would never happen. Sleep, when it came at all, must have been fitful, broken by nightmares, by the sounds of footsteps, by the women shifting on their pallets, by the guards changing outside, by her own racing heart. There is a reason sleep deprivation is used as a torture technique. It breaks down your mental defences. It makes you vulnerable, confused, less able to think clearly. And Anne, watched constantly, in a high-stress situation, accused of capital crimes, separated from everyone she loved. She was sleep-deprived for more than 2 weeks. That does something to a person. But here is the remarkable thing. Despite the exhaustion, despite the trauma, despite everything, Anne held on to her dignity. She kept praying. She kept insisting on her innocence. She kept her faith right up to the end. On that final night, May 18th into May 19th, when she knew for certain that this time the execution would happen, she did not sleep at all. She spent the entire night in prayer. All night, from dusk to dawn, praying with her chaplain, preparing her soul, making peace with what was coming. And when dawn broke on May 19th, she was still awake. She celebrated Mass again, took communion again, swore her innocence again, and then she ate breakfast. Breakfast. On the morning of your execution. Because you have to do something normal, something human, something that acknowledges you are still alive for these last few hours. So you eat. Even though your stomach is probably in knots, even though you can barely taste anything. You eat because it is routine, it is control, it is a last small act of being alive. And then she waited for Kingston to come and tell her it was time. And when he came at 8 a.m. and said the moment was near, she was ready, dressed carefully. Hair arranged, ermine trim on her cloak, crimson kirtle underneath. Every detail chosen with purpose. She had spent the night preparing her soul, the morning preparing her appearance. Both mattered. Both were under her control when nothing else was. The night she could not sleep, the hours spent praying instead, the dark, quiet moments when it was just Anne and God and the terrible knowledge of what was coming. Those nights are part of the story too, not the dramatic part, not the part movies focus on, but the real part, the human part, the part where a woman facing death turned to the only thing she had left, her faith. Do you have something like that? Something that could sustain you through 17 nights of waiting to die? Something bigger than yourself that could hold you up when everything else fell apart? For Anne, it was God. For you, it might be something else. But we all need something. Because life has a way of bringing us to our knees. Maybe not as dramatically as it did for Anne. But we all face nights when sleep will not come, when fear is overwhelming, when we need something beyond ourselves to hold on to. Anne found that in prayer, in the sacrament, in the belief that even if Henry VIII condemned her, even if the court found her guilty, even if she died a traitor's death, God knew the truth. And that had to be enough. 17 nights, each one a little death of its own, a little dying of hope, of plans, of the future. Until finally, on the morning of May 19th, after a night spent entirely awake, entirely in prayer, Anne Boleyn was ready for the actual death. The final one, the one that would end the waiting. But before we get to that scaffold, before we see her final walk and hear her final words, we need to understand one more transformation that happened in those dark hours. Because somewhere between the hysteria of the first night and the composed dignity of the last morning, Anne changed. Not in her innocence, not in her faith, but in her understanding of what power she had left. She could not save herself. She could not save the men who died with her. She could not convince Henry or Cromwell or anyone who mattered that she was innocent. But she could control how she died. She could control her final words, her final appearance, her final legacy. And that realization, that shift from hoping for survival to preparing for a dignified death, that is the transformation we are going to explore next. Anne Boleyn, the queen who could not sleep, was about to become Anne Boleyn, the woman who faced her execution with such grace that even her enemies had to take notice. But that story comes next. For now, rest easy knowing that through all those sleepless nights, through all that darkness and fear, she never stopped fighting for the one thing they could not take from her, the truth. And 500 years later, we know it. Good night, everyone. The dawn is coming. Something happened to Anne Boleyn between the hysteria of May the 2nd and the serenity of May 19th. Something that Kingston himself noted. Something that even her enemies could not ignore. She changed. Not physically, though witnesses said she looked radiant, almost beautiful in a way she had not been before, but internally, fundamentally. The Anne Boleyn who walked to the scaffold on that Friday morning was not the same Anne Boleyn who had arrived at the Tower 17 days earlier, weeping and laughing in wild swings of emotion. This is not a ghost story, this is not mythology. This is a documented psychological phenomenon that modern science can actually explain, and it might be the most remarkable part of Anne Boleyn's entire story, the part that turns her from a tragic figure into something else entirely, something transcendent. Let me introduce you to a concept that might sound a bit technical at first, but stay with me because it is going to change how you see Anne's final days. It is called SIGHT. Suffering-Induced Transformational Experience. The acronym was coined by a transpersonal psychologist named Steve Taylor, who spent years studying people who went through extreme trauma, and came out the other side fundamentally changed. Not broken, changed, transformed, into something that looked, from the outside, almost like enlightenment. Taylor studied 32 individuals who experienced this phenomenon, people who had faced bereavement, serious illness, disability, encounters with death through accidents or medical conditions, intense stress that broke them down to nothing. And what he found consistently across all these cases was a pattern, a transformation that happened when everything fell apart. Here is how it works. We all have what psychologists call the ego, not in the narcissistic sense, but in the psychological sense. Your ego is your sense of self. It is built from all your attachments, your job, your relationships, your plans for the future, your identity as a mother, a queen, a daughter, a wife, all the things you use to define yourself, all the things you hold on to feel secure in the world. When you face extreme trauma, when everything that defines you is ripped away, one of two things happens. Either you have a psychological breakdown, a complete collapse into what we might call madness, or, in rarer cases, something extraordinary occurs. The ego dissolves, it breaks apart, and in that void, in that space where your old self used to be, a new self emerges. A self that is paradoxically free, fearless, at peace, because it has let go of all the attachments that create suffering in the first place. Taylor found that people who experienced this transformation reported increased well-being, intensified perception, a sense of connection to everything around them, less fear of death, and a profound inner peace. They described feeling reborn, like they were different people living in the same body, Does any of this sound familiar? Does it remind you of anyone we have been talking about? Let us look at the evidence. On May the 2nd, when Anne arrived at the tower, Kingston reported that she fell to her knees weeping, then laughing, then weeping again. She was hysterical, desperate, talking compulsively, trying to make sense of the charges, asking about her father, her brother, the men accused with her. Her mind was racing. Her emotions were all over the place, so classic trauma response. She was in psychological freefall. But by May 18th, something had shifted. When Kingston told Anne that her execution was delayed again, she did not panic. She did not break down. She said, and I quote, "Not that she desired death, but that she thought herself prepared to die." Prepared to die, not hoping to live, not begging for mercy, not frantically trying to find a way out, prepared, accepting, ready. The fear was gone, and in its place was something that looked, to everyone who witnessed it, like profound peace. Kingston himself, a man who had seen plenty of prisoners in the tower, plenty of people facing execution, was struck by Anne's composure. He wrote to Cromwell that Anne had much joy and pleasure in death. Joy and pleasure in death. Those are not the words of a woman in denial. Those are the words of someone who has undergone a fundamental psychological shift. And it gets even more striking. Multiple witnesses described Anne as radiant in those final days. Beautiful, glowing. One account said that as she walked to the scaffold, she looked as gay as if she were not going to die. Not grim, not terrified, not even resigned in a sad way, gay. Which in 16th century English meant joyful, lively, bright. How do you explain that? How does someone go from the hysteria of the first few days to the radiance of the last morning, unless something profound happened internally? Let us think about what Anne lost during those 17 days. She lost everything. Her crown, her freedom, her future, her daughter. She would never see Elizabeth again, never hold her, never watch her grow up. Her identity as queen was stripped away. Her identity as wife was gone. Henry had already moved on to Jane Seymour, her identity as a Boleyn, tainted forever by accusations of incest and adultery. Her plans, her hopes, her dreams for religious reform, for a strong England, for a dynasty, all gone. Everything that made Anne Boleyn who she was, every attachment she had, was systematically destroyed. And at some point, probably during one of those long, sleepless nights, probably while praying with the sacrament in her room, Anne let go. Not out of giving up, but out of acceptance. She stopped fighting. She stopped trying to control the outcome. She stopped clinging to the ego, to the identity, to all the things she thought defined her. And in that letting go, paradoxically, she found freedom. This is not religious language, by the way, though Anne would have understood it in religious terms. This is psychology. This is what happens when human beings face the absolute worst and somehow find a way through it that transforms them. Taylor describes it like this. When you're at the point of devastation and desolation, when everything you thought you were has been swept away, you are paradoxically close to a state of liberation, because all the things that create suffering, all the attachments, all the ego-driven fears and desires, they are gone. And what is left is something essential, something fearless. Anne Boleyn, whether she knew it or not, underwent a sight, a suffering-induced transformational experience, and the evidence is everywhere in the historical record. She swore on the sacrament twice that she was innocent. That is not the act of someone in denial. That is someone who has absolute clarity, absolute peace with the truth. Someone who knows with certainty that even if the world condemns her, God knows her innocence. And that is enough. She joked about her little neck. Dark humour, yes, but Also a sign that she had transcended the fear. She was not paralyzed by terror, she could look at the absurdity of the situation and laugh. Gallows humor is often a sign of someone who has accepted death and moved beyond it psychologically. She spent her final night in prayer, not in panic, not trying to scheme or escape, but in communion with something bigger than herself, letting go of everything except the essential. And on that final morning she walked to the scaffold with her head high. She made a speech that was gracious, composed, dignified. She did not rant, she did not weep, she did not collapse. She said what needed to be said, she commended her soul to Christ, and she knelt down calmly. Witnesses said she showed no fear, none. That is extraordinary. How many of us could face our own death, especially a violent public death, with no fear? That is not normal human behavior. That is the behavior of someone who has undergone a profound transformation. Now, I want to be clear about something. This is not about explaining away Anne's courage or diminishing it. Some historians have argued that we do not need to look for psychological explanations for Anne's behavior, that her deep faith and natural courage are enough to explain her composure. And they have a point. Anne was brave. She was devout. She was raised in a culture that valued making good death. All of that is true, but I think the sight framework actually enhances our understanding, because it shows us that Anne's courage was not just about gritting her teeth and enduring. It was about a genuine transformation, a shift in consciousness, a letting go of fear at such a deep level that she genuinely was at peace. That is not just brave, that is transcendent. And here is why this matters. Here is why I wanted to tell you about this, because Anne Boleyn's transformation is not unique to her. It is a human capacity, a potential that exists in all of us. When we face suffering, when we are broken down to nothing, we have a choice. We can collapse into despair, or we can, if we are fortunate, if we find the right conditions, transform. We can let go of the ego, the attachments, the things that bind us to suffering, and we can emerge as something freer, more peaceful, more essentially human. You do not have to be facing execution to experience this. People have experienced sights after the death of a loved one, after a devastating illness, after losing everything they thought defined them. The specifics do not matter. What matters is the intensity of the suffering and the willingness, or the capacity, to let go. Anne had no choice but to let go. Everything was taken from her. But in that taking, in that absolute loss, she found something that could not be taken. Her essential self, her steel, her connection to something eternal. Do you have attachments in your life that are creating suffering? Things you're clinging to so tightly that the thought of losing them terrifies you. Your job, your relationship, your plans for the future, your identity as a certain kind of person. Anne Boleyn lost all of that and found peace on the other side, not because she wanted to lose it, but because when she did, she discovered that she was more than her attachments, more than her ego, more than her suffering. That is the lesson. That is the transformation. That is what happened in the Tower of London in May 1536 that most people do not talk about because it is hard to see from the outside. But it is there in every witness account. It is there in Kingston's letters. It is there in the descriptions of her radiance, her composure, her lack of fear. Anne Boleyn walked to that scaffold as someone who had been broken down and rebuilt, as someone who had faced the absolute worst the world could throw at her and emerged somehow at peace, not happy, not thrilled to die, but at peace, accepting, free, and 500 years later we can still learn from that. We can still be inspired by that. Because suffering is universal, trauma is universal, loss is universal, but transformation, that is possible too. Rare, yes. Difficult, absolutely, but possible. When everything falls apart, when you're at your lowest, when it feels like there is nothing left. Remember Anne Boleyn. Remember that sometimes at the point of devastation there is a doorway, not to escape, but to transformation, to a version of yourself that is no longer bound by fear, no longer defined by attachment, by no longer suffering from the ego's endless demands. That is what Anne found. In the darkness of the tower, in the sleepless nights, in the prayers and the tears and the eventual acceptance, she found freedom. And she carried that freedom with her to the scaffold. And it changed how she died. It changed how people remembered her. It changed, in some small way, history itself. Because a woman who dies in terror and despair is just a victim. But a woman who dies with dignity, grace, and peace, that is a legacy. That is power. That is something that survives 500 years and still inspires people who read her story. Anne Boleyn, in her final days, became more than a queen who fell from grace. She became a symbol of the human capacity to transform suffering into something transcendent, to face death with open eyes and an open heart, to let go of everything and discover that what remains is enough. That is the transformation. That is the shift from terror to transcendence. And it happened in the Tower of London in May 1536, witnessed by Kingston, by the four women, by Archbishop Cranmer, by everyone who saw her in those final days and marvelled at the change. She was ready, not because she wanted to die, but because she had learned, through the most brutal education possible, how to be free. And that freedom, that peace, that transcendence, that could not be taken away. Not by Henry, not by Cromwell, not by the executioner's sword. It was hers, and it remains hers, forever. We are almost to the scaffold now, almost to the end of this story, but before we get there we need to talk about what came next, because the transformation was real, but so was the execution, and the details of that morning, of those final moments, they matter too. They are part of the legacy, part of the lesson. So stay with me. We are almost there. And what happens next is both heartbreaking and, in its own strange way, beautiful. Because Anne Boleyn, transformed by suffering, walked to her death as few people ever have, and that final walk, those final words, they are the culmination of everything we have been building toward. Let us go there together. One more step, one more part of the story, the ending that became somehow a beginning. 2 days before Anne died, 5 men walked to their deaths for crimes they did not commit. One of them was her brother. Imagine that. Imagine knowing that your brother, the person you grew up with, is going to be executed for supposedly sleeping with you. An accusation so vile, so twisted, that even in the 16th century people found it hard to believe. And imagine knowing that you cannot save him, that you cannot even see him one last time to tell him you are sorry, or that you love him, or that this is all wrong. May 17th, 1536, Wednesday morning. 5 men were led out of the Tower of London to Tower Hill, where a scaffold had been built specially high so the crowds could get a good view. Because Henry wanted a spectacle. He wanted the public to see these traitors die. He wanted validation. He wanted people to believe that justice was being served. But the crowd was not as enthusiastic as Henry had hoped. Because even then, even in the moment, people had doubts. These men were not despised criminals. They were courtiers, respected, well known. Henry Norris was the king's own groom of the stool, one of his closest companions. Francis Weston was a favourite, young and charming. William Brereton held power in Wales. Mark Smeaton was a talented musician. And George Boleyn, Anne's brother. A poet, a diplomat, a man of intelligence and culture, And they were all about to die, for nothing, for lies, for a king who wanted to be free. Let me tell you about these men, not just their names, but who they were, because they matter. They are not footnotes. They are human beings who had families, friends, futures. And those futures ended on Tower Hill on a Wednesday morning in May. George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, went first. Rank determined the order. The highest in status died first, which meant George did not have to watch the others die. Small mercy. He was 32 years old, Anne's younger brother, the son of Thomas Boleyn, the nephew of the Duke of Norfolk. A man who had served on diplomatic missions, who wrote poetry, who had a wife named Jane and no children. A man accused of the most unthinkable crime, incest with his own sister. There is no evidence, none. The accusation was based on one thing: he had spent time alone with Anne, in her chambers, talking, as siblings do, as courtiers do, as people who cared about religious reform and the future of England do. But Cromwell twisted it, made it sinister, made it sexual, and a jury, hand-picked and terrified, found him guilty. George stood on the scaffold and looked out at the crowd, hundreds of people, maybe thousands, all there to watch him die, and he gave a speech, a long one, longer than most, because George had things to say, and this was his last chance to say them. The Chronicle of Calais recorded his words, "Christian men, I am born under the law, and judged under the law, and die under the law, and the law hath condemned me. Masters all, I am not come hither for to preach, but for to die, for I have deserved to die if I had 20 lives, more shamefully than can be devised, for I am a wretched sinner, and I have sinned shamefully." Stop there for a second. Does that sound like a confession to incest? To adultery with the Queen? No. It sounds like a man acknowledging that he is human, that he has sinned, which, in 1536, everyone had. Sin was universal. But there was a script to follow. Execution etiquette. You acknowledged that you were a sinner. You praised the king. You asked people to pray for you. You did not rant. You did not protest your innocence loudly, because if you did, your family would suffer. Your property would be confiscated forever. Your name would be stained for generations. So George followed the script. But he also did something remarkable. He preached. He warned the crowd. He said, "I pray you take heed by me, and especially my lords and gentlemen of the court, the which I have been among. Take heed by me, and beware of such a fall." And then he said something that has echoed through history, something powerful. And whereas I am slandered by it, I have been diligent to read it and set it forth truly. But if I had been as diligent to observe it, and done and lived thereafter, as I was to read it and set it forth, I had not come to this. He was talking about God's word, about the Bible, about the religious reforms he had championed. He was saying essentially, I read the scripture, I promoted it, but I did not live it fully. And that is my regret. Not the crimes he was accused of, but the fact that he had not been a perfect Christian, that he'd been human. It was brave, it was honest, and it was heartbreaking. Because this man who was about to lose his head was using his final words to preach a sermon, to warn others, to cling to the faith that had defined his life. Then he knelt, placed his head on the block, and the axe fell. One stroke, George Boleyn was dead. His body was taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower, where he was buried in the chancel before the high altar. 2 days later, his sister would join him there. Next was Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool. That title sounds odd to modern ears, but it was one of the most intimate, powerful positions at court. Norris helped the king with his most private needs, including using the toilet. He was trusted. He was close. He and Henry used to be friends. But Norris had made a mistake. He had joked with Anne, flirted maybe. Courtly love was a game in 1536, harmless banter, except when Cromwell decided it was not harmless, when he decided it was evidence of adultery, of conspiracy to kill the king and put Anne's lover on the throne. Norris had protested his innocence. Even under interrogation by Henry himself, he'd refused to confess. He had said nothing, and now, on the scaffold, he said almost nothing again. George Constantine, his servant, witnessed the executions and later wrote that Norris said almost nothing at all. Why? Was it defiance? Was it grief? Was it the knowledge that words would not matter anymore? We do not know, but that silence is haunting. A man who could have spoken, who could have retracted a confession he never made, who could have defended Anne, chose silence instead. Maybe because he knew it was futile, maybe because he was too broken to speak, maybe because silence was the only dignity he had left. The axe fell. Henry Norris, the king's friend, was dead. His body went to the churchyard of St. Peter ad Vincula, a commoner's burial, even though he had served the king for years. Third was Francis Weston, 25 years old, young, handsome, a favourite of the king, knighted at Anne's coronation in 1533, from a wealthy family who had tried desperately to save him. They had petitioned, they had begged, they had offered money. Nothing worked, because this was not about guilt or innocence. This was about clearing the way for Jane Seymour. Weston had spent his last night writing a list of debts. He owed money to the king, to his family, to the Boleyns. He wanted it recorded. He wanted to die with his affairs in order. He wrote a letter to his parents asking for forgiveness, not for adultery with the Queen, but for being a flawed son, for not living up to their expectations, for disappointing them. On the scaffold, Weston said, "I had thought to have lived in abomination yet this 20 or 30 years, and then to have made amends. I thought little it would have come to this. Do you hear that?" He thought he had time. He thought he would live a long life, make mistakes, enjoy himself, and then, later, become a better person. He thought he had decades ahead of him, and instead, at 25, he was kneeling at a blood-soaked block about to lose his head. Have you ever thought you had all the time in the world? Have you ever put off being kind, being good, being the person you want to be because you assumed there would be time later? Weston did, and he was wrong. The axe fell. Francis Weston, who thought he had 30 more years, was dead. Fourth was William Brereton, a groom of the Privy Chamber, powerful in Wales and Cheshire, a man who had enemies, local rivals who might have whispered to Cromwell that Brereton would be a convenient addition to the list of accused. Because that is how it worked. This was not just about Anne. This was about settling scores, about removing people who were inconvenient. Brereton's speech was short. Some accounts say he simply said, "I have offended God and the king, pray for me." Others record him repeating, "I have deserved to die if it were 1,000 deaths. But the cause wherefore I die, judge not. But if ye judge, judge the best. Judge the best." That is a plea, a quiet, desperate plea to the crowd. Do not believe the worst of me, judge me as innocent. Give me the benefit of the doubt, because I cannot defend myself anymore, because the law has already condemned me. But you, the people watching, you can choose what to believe. Did anyone listen? Did anyone judge the best? Or did they just watch another head roll? The axe fell. William Brereton was dead. And finally Mark Smeaton, the musician, the lowest in rank, which meant he had to stand there and watch 4 men die before him. Can you imagine? 4 beheadings, 4 bodies collapsing, 4 heads severed. Blood everywhere, the smell, the sound, the horror. And knowing you are next, Smeaton was the only one who had confessed. Under torture, most historians believe, though the records do not say explicitly. He was young, probably low-born, Flemish or English depending on the source. He had been brought to court for his musical talent. He played for the Queen, she liked him, gave him gifts, money, attention, and that was enough for Cromwell to destroy him. On the scaffold, Smeaton said, "Masters, I pray you all pray for me, for I have deserved the death." That is it. Short, simple. He did not retract his confession. He did not clear Anne's name, and when Anne heard about it later, she was devastated. She reportedly said, "Did he not exonerate me before he died of the public infamy he laid on me? Alas, I fear his soul will suffer for it." She was worried about his soul. Even in her own terror, even knowing that she was going to die in 2 days, she was worried that Mark Smeaton had damned himself by dying with a lie on his lips. That is the kind of person Anne was, thinking about someone else's eternal fate even as her own life was ending. Why did Smeaton not retract his confession? Maybe he was too scared. Maybe he thought it would not matter. Maybe he had been promised that his family would be spared if he kept quiet. Maybe he was so traumatized by torture that he could not think straight anymore. We will never know, but his stallance, his failure to clear Anne haunted her. The axe fell. Mark Smeaton, the musician who played beautiful songs, was dead. His body went to the churchyard with Brereton. 2 men in one grave, Norris and Weston in another. 5 men, 5 executions, 1 morning, all for lies, all for a king who wanted a new wife and a male heir. All so that Henry VIII could tell himself he was the victim, that his wife had betrayed him, that he had no choice. But there is one more detail, one more piece of cruelty that you need to know about. While these 5 men were being executed on Tower Hill, while their blood was soaking into the scaffold, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was at Lambeth, and he was declaring Anne's marriage to Henry null and void. Think about that timing. Her brother and 4 other men were dying as traitors, condemned for adultery with the Queen. And at the same time, Cranmer was saying that Anne had never been the Queen at all, that the marriage was invalid, that it had never happened. Do you see the contradiction? If the marriage was not real, then Anne was not the Queen, and if she was not the Queen, then sleeping with her would not be treason. So why were 5 men dying for treason if the woman they supposedly slept with was never the Queen in the first place? It makes no sense. None of this makes sense, which is the point. This was not about logic, this was about power. About Henry getting what he wanted and destroying anyone in his way. The law did not matter. The truth did not matter. Only the king's will mattered. And Anne, locked in the tower, heard about the executions. She heard that her brother was dead, that the men accused with her were dead, that Mark Smeaton had not cleared her name, and she had to live with that knowledge for 2 more days. 2 more days of knowing that everyone she cared about was gone, that her daughter was now illegitimate, that her marriage had been declared null, that she was alone, except she was not alone, not in the way that mattered, because somewhere during those 2 days, during those last long hours, Anne completed her transformation. She stopped fighting. She stopped hoping for rescue. She accepted death. And she found peace. The men who died first paved the way in a horrible sense. They showed her how it was done, how to face the scaffold with dignity, how to follow the script but keep your truth intact, how to die well in a world that had condemned you unjustly. George in particular showed her, her brother. The last member of her family who stood by her until the end. He died bravely, he died faithful. He died speaking God's word even when God's world had abandoned him, and Anne, grieving him, learned from him. She learned how to do what needed to be done. 2 more days of waiting, of praying, of preparing, and then it would be her turn. Her turn to walk to a scaffold, her turn to make a speech, her turn to kneel and place her head down and wait for the blade. but she would not be facing an axe. Henry, in his so-called mercy, had ordered something different for Anne, something that would arrive from Calais, something that would change the nature of her execution and become part of her legend. The swordsman was coming, and with him the final chapter of Anne Boleyn's life, a chapter that would last only moments but would echo through centuries, a chapter written in blood and steel and the extraordinary courage of a woman who had lost everything and found, somehow, a way to face death with grace. The men died first, but Anne would die last, and die unforgettably. Here is the detail that changes everything, the detail that proves beyond any shadow of doubt that Anne Boleyn's trial was nothing but theatre, a performance with a predetermined ending, the detail that makes the whole charade fall apart when you look at it closely. Henry VIII ordered the swordsman from Calais before Anne's trial even happened, before the verdict, before the jury deliberated, before Anne stood in that room and defended herself with eloquence and dignity. The executioner was already on his way. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who would kill the Queen was travelling to England while she was still presumed innocent under the law, while the trial was still supposedly determining her guilt or innocence, while justice was supposedly being served. The swordsman was ordered around May the 12th, according to most historical estimates. Anne's trial was on May 15th. The execution was May 9th. Do the math. A messenger on horseback from London to Dover, a boat across the Channel, travel from Calais or Saint-Omer to find this expert executioner, then the return journey, bringing him back to England with his sword. That trip takes time, days, possibly a week. And Henry ordered it before he knew the verdict, because he already knew the verdict, because the verdict was never in doubt. Who was this man, this swordsman from across the sea? Well, that is where it gets interesting. For centuries, people believed his name was Jean Rambaud. It sounds dramatic, right? Jean Rambaud, the French executioner. Novels have been written about him, stories told. But here is the truth. We do not actually know his name with certainty. What we do know is this. He was an expert, a professional. Kingston, in his letters to Cromwell, wrote, "I am very glad to hear of the executor of Cales, for he can handle that matter." Handle that matter, as if beheading the Queen of England was just another job, just another technical challenge requiring the right specialist. Recent research by Dr. Mickey Mayhew suggests the executioner's first name was Bartholomew, that he was of English descent but born in Calais to a trading family, that he was trained in the French method of execution, which was considered more merciful, more skilled than the English axe. Whether his name was Jean or Bartholomew or something else entirely, what matters is what he represented: a swift, clean death. One stroke, no mistakes, no botched hacking, no need for a knife to finish the job, as sometimes happened with the axe. Henry was being merciful, you see, or at least that is what he wanted people to think. He could have had Anne burned at the stake. That was the traditional sentence for a female traitor. Burned alive, screaming, suffering, taking minutes or even longer to die. He could have used the English axe, which was brutal and unreliable. The executioner at the Tower was not particularly skilled. Executions with the axe sometimes took multiple blows, 3, 4, 5 swings before the head finally separated from the body. But Henry did not want that for Anne, or rather, he did not want the spectacle of it. He did not want people watching her suffer. He did not want the crowd to turn against him out of pity, so he ordered the sword. The French method. Quick, professional, dignified, and expensive. The swordsman was paid £23, 6 shillings, and 8 pence. In today's money, that is roughly £7,000 to £8,000, just for one execution, That is how much Henry was willing to spend to make Anne's death look merciful. But the timing of the order? That was not mercy, that was certainty. That was a king who knew exactly what was going to happen and when. The Spanish Chronicle, written close to the time of these events, states that Henry sent a week before to Saint Omer for a headsman who could cut off the head with a sword instead of an axe. A week before? Before what? Before the trial? Before the verdict? The wording is vague, but the implication is damning. Mary of Hungary, the regent of the Netherlands and sister of Emperor Charles V, wrote about it too. She noted that the executioner came from the Holy Roman Empire's territory, from Charles's lands, as if Henry was making a political statement. Look, even your own subjects are helping me execute this woman who used to be your ally. It was calculated, all of it. The method, the executioner, the timing. Nothing about Anne's fall was accidental. Nothing was left to chance, and Anne knew it. On the morning of May 18th, when she thought she was going to die at 9 in the morning, she said to Kingston, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." And then she put her hands round her throat and laughed. That dark humour again, that coping mechanism. But underneath it, think about what she was saying. She knew about the swordsman. She knew he was good. She knew Henry had gone to the trouble of bringing someone skilled. Did she understand what that meant? Did she realise that the swordsman's presence proved her fate had been sealed before the trial even began? Maybe, maybe not, but we understand it now. 500 years later, we can look at the timeline and see the truth. The trial was a sham. The verdict was predetermined. Justice was never the goal. Removing Anne was the goal, and every detail was orchestrated to achieve that end. Let me tell you how the French method worked, because it is important. It was not just about the sword being sharper than the axe, though it was. It was about the entire approach, the technique, the psychology. In England, when you were beheaded with an axe, you lay down. You put your head on a block of wood, face down and neck exposed, vulnerable, humiliated, like an animal at a butcher's shop. The executioner stood over you with a heavy axe, sometimes taking practice swings to line up the angle, and then he swung, and if he missed, or if the axe was dull, or if his aim was off, he swung again and again, until the job was done. It was brutal, degrading, terrifying. The French method was different. You knelt upright, you stayed on your knees, sitting back on your heels or kneeling straight. The executioner used a sword, not an axe, lighter, faster, more precise. And he wore soft-soled shoes, quiet shoes, so he could move around the scaffold without making noise, without alerting you. Because here is the key, the French executioner distracted you. He called out to an assistant for his sword. You turned your head to look. And in that instant, when your neck was stretched and exposed, he struck. One clean stroke. Your head came off before you even knew what was happening. It sounds almost humane, right? Almost kind. Except it was still death. It was still an execution. It was still a queen, kneeling on a scaffold, surrounded by strangers, about to lose her life for crimes she did not commit. But at least it was quick. At least she would not feel it. At least her last moments would not be filled with the terror of waiting for the blade, watching it rise, knowing it was about to fall. The swordsman's method gave Anne one final gift, surprise. She would not see it coming. She would not have time to be afraid in that last second. One moment she would be alive, and the next she would not be. Clean, swift, as merciful as an execution could possibly be. And Henry paid handsomely for it, because even though he wanted her dead, even though he had orchestrated her downfall, even though he was about to marry Jane Seymour within days of Anne's execution, some part of him still could not bear the thought of her suffering. Or maybe he just did not want the crowd to witness her suffering. Maybe it was all about optics, about how it looked, about maintaining the fiction that he was a merciful king who'd been betrayed by a wicked wife. We will never know what was in Henry's head, but we know what he did, and what he did speaks volumes. The swordsman arrived finally on May 18th, or maybe it was earlier. The timeline is a bit unclear, but he was definitely in London by the 18th, because that was the day Anne's execution was originally scheduled. 9 in the morning, Tower Green. The scaffold was ready. The crowd was gathering. Anne had spent the night in prayer, thinking she would die at dawn. But 9 o'clock came and went. No execution. The swordsman had not arrived yet, or maybe there were not enough witnesses, or maybe Henry changed his mind at the last second. The records are vague, but the execution was postponed. Until noon, they said. Anne waited, prepared herself all over again. Noon came, still no execution. It was postponed again, until the next day, May 19th. Can you imagine? Being told you're going to die at 9 in the morning, spending the night preparing your soul, saying your goodbyes such as they were, accepting your fate, and then being told to wait, to keep waiting, to prepare all over again, to live through that fear and acceptance and resignation a second time, a third time. It is torture. Unintentional, maybe. Logistical, probably, but torture nonetheless. Kingston tried to reassure her. He said the blow would be quick, that there would be no pain, that the swordsman was very skilled. And Anne, exhausted and resigned, made that dark joke about her little neck. Because what else could she do? She could not control when she would die. She could not control the timing or the method, or anything about her fate except how she faced it. So she joked. She held on to her dignity. She waited. And on the morning of May 19th, finally, it was time. The swordsman was ready. The witnesses were assembled. The scaffold was prepared. Kingston came to her chambers and told her the moment was near. And Anne, who had been waiting for this for 2 days, who had been preparing for this for 17 days, said she was ready. She had spent the night in prayer. Again, with her chaplain John Skipp, she had taken communion. Again, she had sworn her innocence. Again. And now, finally, it was time to face the thing she'd been waiting for. The thing that had been inevitable since the moment Henry ordered that swordsman from Calais before her trial even began. The sword itself is an interesting detail. We do not know much about it, but swords used for execution were special. Heavier than combat swords, broader, designed specifically for beheading, not for stabbing or slashing in battle, just for taking heads. Some sources say the swordsman's blade was custom forged in Toledo, from steel that we would now classify as SAE 460, high-carbon steel, flexible but strong, able to hold an edge, twice the breadth and weight of a combat sword of the era. There is a claim that descendants of the swordsman's family still have the sword, that it's been passed down through generations, broken now into 2 pieces, owned by 2 different branches of the family in Italy. The family tradition, they say, includes the story of how their ancestor beheaded Anne Boleyn. Whether that is true or not, who can say? But it is a remarkable thought, that the weapon that ended Anne's life might still exist somewhere. A physical link to that morning in May 1536. The sword had an inscription according to one fictionalized account, though we cannot verify this. La main droite, c'est monseigneur. La vertu, l'amour, le mort. The right hand is my lord. Virtue, love, death. A strange phrase for a weapon designed to kill, but fitting in its way, because the executioner saw himself as doing the Lord's work, as an instrument of justice, not a murderer. He was the right hand of the law, virtue and love and death all tangled together. Whether that inscription was real or invented by a novelist, it captures something true. The executioner was not Anne's enemy. He was not there because he hated her. He was there because he was hired, because he was good at his job, because Henry VIII wanted the best, and the best cost money, the best took time to arrange, the best had to be ordered in advance, before the trial, before the verdict, before justice was even pretended to be served. That is the heart of it. That is the piece that proves everything. Not the evidence presented at trial, which was flimsy and contradictory. Not the testimony of frightened courtiers or tortured musicians. Not even the verdict itself, though it was unanimous. No, the proof is the swordsman. The fact that he was ordered before Anne was found guilty. The fact that Henry knew, with absolute certainty, that she would be condemned. That the trial was a formality. That the jury would do what they were told. That Anne's eloquent defence, her insistence on her innocence, her grace under pressure, none of it would matter, because the decision had already been made. Henry VIII, the king who claimed to love justice, who presented himself as a godly prince, who demanded that everything be done according to law, had already ordered the executioner, had already paid for the sword, had already arranged for his wife to die in a specific way at a specific time. And when the trial happened, the jury just had to follow the script. They had to find her guilty, because if they did not, if they somehow found her innocent, what would Henry do with the swordsman from Calais? Send him home with an apology and a travel stipend? No, the swordsman was there because Anne was going to die. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, and everyone involved knew it. The jury knew it. Cromwell knew it. Anne probably knew it. And 500 years later, we definitely know it. Because you do not order an executioner for someone you think might be innocent. You do not hire an expert swordsman from France to kill your wife if you have even the slightest doubt about her guilt. You do not spend £23 on a specialised execution if there is any chance the trial might go her way. Henry ordered that swordsman because he knew. He knew he was going to kill Anne. He knew he was going to marry Jane Seymour. He knew he was going to start over. Try again for a son. Move on with his life, and the trial. The trial was just for show, for appearances, for the history books. So he could say later, "She was tried and found guilty by a jury of her peers. I had no choice. The law condemned her, not me." But the swordsman tells the truth. The swordsman, ordered before the verdict, reveals the lie at the heart of the whole thing. Anne Boleyn was not executed because she was guilty. She was executed because Henry wanted her dead. And everything else, all the charges and the trials and the speeches and the witnesses, all of it was just window dressing. The swordsman knew it. He came to England, did his job, collected his £23, and went home. He was not a villain. He was not even particularly important in the grand scheme of things. He was just a craftsman, a specialist, a man who was very good at one specific terrible thing. But his presence in London on May 19th, 1536, proves more than all the trial records combined. It proves that Anne never had a chance. That from the moment Henry decided she had to go, her fate was sealed. And no amount of innocence, no eloquence, no prayers, no dignity could save her. The swordsman was coming, and he was coming because the king had ordered him, not after the verdict, before it. That is the story the swordsman tells, and it is the most damning evidence of all. Not against Anne, against Henry, against the system, against the fiction that any of this was justice. It was murder, premeditated, carefully planned, executed, if you will pardon the dark irony, with precision and forethought. And now, finally, after 17 days of waiting, after 2 postponements, after nights of prayer and days of fear, Anne Boleyn was going to meet that swordsman, was going to walk to the scaffold, was going to kneel, was going to speak her final words. And that morning, May 19th, 1536, is where we are headed next. the last morning, the last walk, the 15 steps from the Queen's lodging to the scaffold, the speech, the final moments, the stroke of the sword. But before we get there, sit with this for a moment. The swordsman proves it, all of it, the whole ugly truth. Anne was innocent. The trial was a sham, and Henry VIII, for all his claims of mercy and justice, ordered his wife's death before anyone had officially declared her guilty. Remember that. Because it matters. Because the truth matters. Even 500 years later. Especially 500 years later. The swordsman is waiting, and so is Anne. One more step, one more part of the story, and then the end. But what an end it will be. Friday, May 19th, 1536. Dawn broke over the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn had not slept. Again. This was the third night in a row she had stayed awake, preparing for death. But this time there would be no postponement. This time it was real. She rose before the sun, or maybe she never lay down at all. She called for her almoner, John Skipp, one last time. They celebrated Mass together in the pre-dawn darkness. She took the sacrament, again swore her innocence before God, again commended her soul to Christ. Again, it was becoming a ritual, a pattern, the only thing she could control in these final hours. And then, at 7 in the morning, she did something that might surprise you. Something so ordinary, so human, so achingly normal, that it breaks your heart when you think about it. Anne Boleyn ate breakfast. On the morning of her execution, knowing she would be dead within hours, she sat down and ate. Because what else was there to do? She was hungry, she was alive, and until the sword fell, life continued. So she ate. Have you ever had a morning where you knew something terrible was coming later in the day? A difficult conversation? A painful goodbye? A moment you were dreading? Did you skip breakfast because your stomach was in knots? Or did you eat anyway, going through the motions because your body needed fuel, even if your mind was screaming? Anne ate. We do not know what she ate. The records do not tell us. But she ate. And that detail, that tiny human detail, makes her so real. Not a queen, not a historical figure, just a woman, sitting in a room eating breakfast on the last morning of her life. After breakfast she dressed. And here is where it gets interesting. Because every single item Anne chose to wear that morning was a message, a statement, a final act of defiance wrapped in fabric and fur. She wore a robe of grey damask, dark grey, almost black in some accounts, trimmed with ermine. Do you know what ermine is? White fur with black tips, the fur of royalty. Only members of the royal family could wear ermine. It was a symbol of status, of power, of legitimacy. Anne's marriage to Henry had been annulled 2 days earlier. Legally, she was no longer the Queen. Legally, she was just Lady Anne Boleyn again. Her daughter Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate. The marriage, Henry claimed, had never been valid. So technically, Anne had no right to wear ermine anymore. But she wore it anyway, because she was making a statement. She was saying, I am the Queen, I was crowned, I was married, I am dying as the Queen of England, not as some disgraced lady. You can take my life, but you cannot take my crown. Underneath the grey damask, she wore a crimson kirtle. A kirtle is like an underdress, the layer beneath the outer gown. And crimson was not a random choice. Crimson was the colour of martyrs, of saints, of people who died for their faith, for truth, for causes greater than themselves. Mary Queen of Scots would do the exact same thing 51 years later. When she walked to her execution in 1587, she wore scarlet, crimson, red, the colour of martyrdom, the colour that said, I am innocent, I am dying for something I did not do, I am a martyr, not a criminal. Anne knew this. She chose crimson deliberately. It was a silent protest, a visual argument that she could not make with words. Her outfit was screaming her innocence when her voice could not. And then there was her hood. Anne Boleyn was famous for wearing French hoods. Elegant, fashionable, daring. French hoods sat back on the head, showing the hair, the face. They were stylish, sexy even. Anne had made them popular at the English court. All the ladies copied her. When Anne wore a French hood, it became the trend. But on the morning of her execution, Anne did not wear a French hood. She wore an English gable hood, the traditional English style, heavy, matronly, conservative, the kind of hood that looked like a little house perched on your head, the kind of hood that Catherine of Aragon wore, the kind of hood that Jane Seymour wore. Why? Why would Anne, who'd always favoured French fashion, who'd always been cutting-edge and modern, choose the dowdy English hood on her last day? Because she was making another statement. She was saying, "I am English. I am your queen. I belong here. This is my country, my home, and I am dying as an English woman, not as some French-influenced outsider that people accused me of being." It was brilliant, subtle, powerful. Every detail of her outfit was chosen with care. Grey damask with ermine, "I am the queen." Crimson kirtle, "I am innocent." A martyr. English abel hood, "I am one of you. I belong here." Anne Boleyn was about to die, but she was controlling the narrative. She was telling her story through her clothes. And 500 years later, we are still talking about it, still analysing it, still understanding the messages she sent with fabric and colour and style. At 8 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on her door. Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, the man who had reported her every word to Cromwell for the past 17 days, the man who'd been kind in his way, but who had never been her friend, the man whose job it was to walk her to her death. He entered the room and said the words she had been waiting to hear. "Madam, the hour is near. You must prepare yourself." And Anne, already dressed, already ready, looked at him and said she was prepared. She had been preparing for days, for 17 days, for this exact moment, and now that it was here, she was ready. Kingston later wrote about that morning. He said Anne seemed calm, composed. "Goodly countenance," he called it. He seemed almost surprised, as if he had expected her to break down, to weep, to beg for mercy. But she did not. She stood there in her carefully chosen outfit and said she was ready. One witness said she had never looked more beautiful. That might sound strange. How could a woman facing execution look beautiful? But think about it. She had spent the night in prayer. She had accepted her fate. She had let go of fear, of anger, of the desperate clinging to life. She had transformed, and that transformation, that inner peace, that grace, under unimaginable pressure, it showed on her face. It radiated from her. People noticed. They wrote it down. Never so beautiful. Because beauty is not just about physical appearance. It is about presence, about dignity, about the light that shines from within when someone has faced the worst and emerged with their soul intact. Anne was beautiful that morning because she was free. Free from fear. Free from the need to fight or scheme or defend herself. Free in the only way that mattered, and it showed. Before she left the room, Anne did one more thing. She gave her ladies final instructions, told them not to weep, reminded them of her innocence, asked them to be brave. She was comforting them. On the morning of her own death, she was taking care of the people around her, making sure they would be okay, thinking about their feelings, their grief, their need for reassurance. That is who Anne Boleyn was, even at the end. Even when she had every right to be selfish, to be consumed by her own terror. She thought about others. She gave them strength, she held them up. And then she walked out of the Queen's lodging, the same rooms where she had spent the night before her coronation 3 years earlier, the same rooms where she had dressed in cloth of gold and jewels, preparing to be crowned. Now she was leaving them for the last time, dressed in grey and crimson, preparing to die. The walk from the Queen's lodging to the scaffold was not far, maybe 50 yards, maybe less. She passed the great hall where her trial had been held 4 days earlier, where she had defended herself with eloquence and grace, where the jury had found her guilty anyway. She walked through Coal Harbour Gate, along the western side of the White Tower, that massive stone fortress, ancient and imposing, that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. Anne Boleyn was a blink, a moment, a brief flash of life in the long history of that place. But what a flash! What a moment! And then she saw it. The scaffold, black drape, built higher than usual so the crowd could see, so everyone could witness the Queen's death, so Henry could have his spectacle. It was not on Tower Hill, where the 5 men had died 2 days earlier. This was inside the Tower grounds, more private, more controlled, only invited witnesses, important people, people Henry trusted, people who would report back what they saw, what they heard, what Anne said. The crowd was not huge, maybe 100 people, maybe a bit more, but every single one of them was someone she knew. Thomas Cromwell, the man who had orchestrated her downfall, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, who had never liked her, Henry Fitzroy, the King's illegitimate son, who had been told that Anne planned to poison him, Thomas Audley, the Lord Chancellor, her enemies, her judges, the people who had condemned her, and maybe a few friends, we do not know for certain, but there are whispers in the records, hints that some of her ladies were there, that maybe Margaret Wyatt, wife of Thomas Wyatt the poet, was present, that the women who had attended her in the Tower, those 4 spy ladies, were there at the end. Anne's eyes swept over the crowd. She saw Cromwell, she saw Brandon, she saw all of them, and she did not flinch. She did not cry, she did not look away. She looked them in the eye, queen to subjects, condemned woman to executioners, human being to human beings. And then Kingston helped her up the scaffold steps. There were just a few steps, 4, maybe 5, but they were the hardest steps she would ever take, because at the top of those steps was the end, the final moment, the place where her life would stop. She climbed them anyway, 1 foot in front of the other, with Kingston at her side, with her ladies behind her, with the crowd watching, with the swordsman waiting somewhere, out of sight, ready to do his job. Anne stepped onto the scaffold, and she turned to face the crowd. It was time for her speech, the last words she would ever speak in public, the last chance to control her story, to say what needed to be said, to leave a legacy in words before the sword took everything else. Do you want to know something remarkable? In all the accounts of that morning, in all the witness statements and letters and chronicles, not one person describes Anne as broken. Not one person says she collapsed in fear or lost her composure. Not one person paints her as a victim being dragged to her death against her will. Every single account describes her as dignified, calm, beautiful, ready. She walked to that scaffold like a queen. She climbed those steps like someone who had already won, even though she was about to lose her life, because she had won in a way. She had refused to let them break her. She had refused to confess to crime she did not commit. She had refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her beg or weep or grovel. She had kept her dignity, her truth, her soul, and that was a victory. Not the victory she wanted, not the victory that would save her life, but a victory nonetheless, a victory that would echo through history. That would make people, 500 years later, look at her story and say, she was innocent, she was brave, she was extraordinary. The grey damask with ermine, the crimson kirtle, the English gable hood, the calm face, the steady steps, the refusal to break, all of it was building to this moment, to the scaffold, to the speech, to the final act of a woman who had been a queen and would die as one, no matter what the annulment said. Kingston stood beside her. The crowd fell silent. The morning air was cool, fresh. Spring in London. Birds singing, maybe. Somewhere in the distance, the sounds of the city waking up. People going about their day completely unaware that a queen was about to die. And Anne Boleyn, 35 years old, dark-haired and dark-eyed, slight and graceful and fierce, took a breath and prepared to speak, to say the words that would be her last, to craft a speech that would be careful and political and true all at once, to walk the impossible line between praising Henry, protecting Elizabeth, and maintaining her innocence. She had thought about this speech. You know she had, during those sleepless nights, during the hours of prayer, during the moments of waiting between postponements. She had planned every word, every phrase, every carefully chosen sentence, because this was it. This was all she had left. Her words, her voice, her final statement to the world, and what she said, how she said it would matter, would shape how people remembered her, would influence whether they believed her guilty or innocent, would determine whether her daughter had a future or was forever stained by her mother's so-called crimes. No pressure, right? Just the weight of history resting on a few sentences spoken on a scaffold in the morning light. Just the entire meaning of her life condensed into one final speech. Just everything she had ever been and ever hoped to be, reduced to words that would either save her reputation or condemn it forever. Anne Boleyn had always been good with words, sharp, witty, intelligent. She had charmed a king with her conversation. She had debated theology with scholars. She had sparred with ambassadors. Words were her weapon, her tool, her power. And now, at the very end, she would use them one last time, not to fight, not to argue, not to defend, but to leave a message, a legacy, a final testament to who she was and what she believed. The crowd was waiting, the swordsman was waiting, death was waiting. But first Anne Boleyn would speak, and the world would listen, and we, 500 years later, would still be talking about what she said and what she meant and what it cost her to say it. That speech is coming. Those words are next. But before we get there, sit with this image for just a moment. A woman in grey and crimson standing on a black draped scaffold about to speak her final words. A woman who ate breakfast on the morning of her execution, who chose her outfit with care, who walked with dignity to her death, who looked her enemies in the eye and did not flinch. Remember her like this, on the scaffold, about to speak, still alive, still defiant, still Anne. Because the next part is the speech, and then the stroke of the sword, and then silence. But right now, in this moment, she is still here, still speaking, still making her mark on history with nothing but words and courage. Let us listen to what she has to say. Silence fell over the crowd. 100 people, maybe more, all watching, all waiting. Anne Boleyn standing on a scaffold about to speak her last words, and every single word mattered. Every syllable would be recorded, analysed, repeated. This was not just a speech, this was her legacy, her final testimony, the last thing the world would hear from her lips. She took a breath, and she spoke. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. Stop right there. Let us unpack that opening sentence, because it is brilliant, carefully constructed, every word chosen with precision. Good Christian people. She is addressing them as equals, as fellow believers. She is not above them, she is one of them. A Christian facing death, same as anyone might. It creates connection, sympathy. It reminds them that she is human. I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die. Notice the repetition. According to the law and by the law, she is emphasizing legality, process. She is not saying the law is right. She is not confessing guilt. She is simply acknowledging that the legal system has condemned her. It is a statement of fact, not an admission of crime, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. This is execution etiquette. You do not criticize the king. You do not rant about injustice. You do not make a scene, because if you do, your family suffers, your property is confiscated forever, your name is destroyed beyond repair. Anne knew the rules, and she followed them. But within those rules she found ways to tell the truth. She continued, I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. Read that carefully. I am come hither to accuse no man. She is not going to name names, not going to point fingers at Cromwell, at the jury, at anyone who destroyed her, because she cannot. That would be speaking against the law, and she just said she would not do that. But listen to the next part. Nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. She is not going to talk about the charges, not going to address the adultery, the incest, the conspiracy. Why? Because she has already defended herself at trial. She has already proclaimed her innocence. And it did not matter, so why waste her breath now? But there is something else in that phrasing. Whereof I am accused and condemned to die, not for which I am guilty, not which I have done, just whereof I am accused. The charges, not the truth, it is subtle. So subtle that you could miss it if you were not paying attention. But it is there. A quiet insistence that accusation and guilt are not the same thing, and then she said the words that have puzzled people for 500 years, the words that sound on the surface like praise, like loyalty, like love. But I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. Wait. What? A gentler and more merciful prince? The man who had just had her framed for adultery and incest? The man who ordered her brother's execution? The man who annulled their marriage and declared their daughter illegitimate? That man was gentle and merciful? This is the part of the speech that makes people angry. That makes modern readers want to scream, Anne, no! Do not praise him. Tell the truth. Call him out. But Anne could not do that. Not if she wanted Elizabeth to survive. Not if she wanted her family to have any chance of recovering. Not if she wanted to die with any shred of dignity or hope that her reputation might someday be restored. So she praised Henry. But look at how she did it. Look at the exact words. A gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. This is a statement about princes in general. She is not saying Henry is gentle and merciful compared to, say, a tyrant like Nero. She is saying he is as gentle and merciful as any prince, which in Tudor England was not saying much. Princes were not known for gentleness. They were known for power, for ruthlessness, for doing whatever it took to maintain control. So she is technically praising him, but she is also very quietly acknowledging that princes are not gentle, that this is the nature of power, that expecting mercy from a king is foolish. And then the key phrase, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. To me, not to others, not objectively, to her, in her experience. And what was her experience? He pursued her for years. He broke with Rome for her. He made her queen. He gave her power, status, jewels, everything she could have wanted. And then he destroyed her, utterly, completely, without mercy. So when she says, to me he was ever a good and gentle lord, she is telling the truth. Her truth. The complicated, twisted, tragic truth of their relationship. He was good to her until he was not. He was gentle until he ordered her execution. It is not praise, it is irony, wrapped in the language of loyalty, disguised as gratitude. But if you listen closely, if you hear what she is really saying, it is heartbreaking. He was good to me, and look where I am now. But she was not done. There was one more sentence, one more carefully crafted piece of her legacy. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. This is the most important line in the entire speech, and it is the one people often overlook. If any person will meddle of my cause, if anyone wants to investigate, to look into the charges, to examine the evidence, to think about what really happened, I require them to judge the best. Judge the best. Not judge me guilty, not judge me innocent, but judge the best. Give me the benefit of the doubt. Assume the best of me, not the worst. Look at my life, look at my actions, look at the lack of evidence, and judge accordingly. It is a plea, hidden in polite language, a request for future generations to see the truth, to question the narrative, to not just accept what Henry and Cromwell said about her. And 500 years later, we have done exactly that. We have judged the best. We have looked at the evidence, the timeline, the motives, and we have concluded that she was innocent, that the charges were fabricated, that she died for nothing. Anne knew she could not change the present, but she could influence the future, and with that one sentence, judge the best, she planted a seed, a question, a doubt in the minds of anyone who heard her speech and thought, wait, why is she not confessing? Why is she not saying goodbye to specific people? Why is she being so careful with her words? Because she was innocent, and she wanted history to know it. Do you see the genius of this speech? On the surface, it is exactly what it needed to be. Submissive, loyal, non-threatening. It follows all the rules. It praises the king. It acknowledges the law. It asks for prayers. Perfect execution speech. But underneath, it is defiant. It is coded. It is Anne Boleyn refusing to confess, refusing to name her supposed lovers, refusing to accept guilt. She is saying, so, I am dying because the law says I must, but I am not saying I deserve this. I am not saying I did these things. I am simply dying, and I am asking you to judge for yourselves. The Frenchman Lancelot de Carle, secretary to the French ambassador, was there. He watched, he listened, and later he wrote a poem about it. He described Anne's voice as somewhat overcome by weakness, but which gathered strength as she went on. She started weak, understandably. She had not slept in days. She was about to die. Her voice faltered, but as she spoke she found strength. The words gave her power. The act of speaking her truth, however coded, gave her courage. De Carles also wrote that the spectators could not refrain from tears. The crowd cried for her. Because even though she was praising the king, even though she was following the script, they could hear what she was really saying. They could see her grace, her dignity, her innocence, and they wept. After the speech, there was a moment, a pause. Anne had said what she needed to say. Now it was time for the final preparations. She removed her gable hood. Her ladies helped. Underneath she wore a linen cap. She tucked her dark hair into it, every strand so that her neck was exposed. Clear, ready for the sword. She paid the executioner. This was customary. You paid the man who was about to kill you. Sounds insane, right? But it was part of the ritual, a way of saying, I forgive you, do your job quickly, make it as painless as possible. The executioner was visibly distressed, according to witnesses. He asked for her forgiveness, not just as a formality, but genuinely. He did not want to do this, but it was his job, and Anne, gracious to the end, forgave him. Her ladies blindfolded her, another piece of fabric tied around her eyes, so she would not see the sword coming, so her last sight would not be the blade, so she could focus on prayer, on God, on peace. And then she knelt. Not laying down, remember, the French method, kneeling upright, sitting back on her heels or kneeling straight. The witnesses differ on the exact position, but she was upright, dignified, even in the moment of death, and she prayed out loud, her final words, not to the crowd this time, to God. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. Over and over. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. A mantra, a prayer, a declaration of faith. She was commending her soul to Christ, not to Henry, not to the law, not to England, to Jesus. To the one judge who knew the truth, who knew her heart, who knew her innocence. She kept praying, kept repeating those words. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. And as she prayed, the executioner moved into position. Quietly. Soft-soled shoes, remember. He called out to his assistant, Bring me the sword. Anne turned her head slightly, instinctively, to hear, to follow the sound, and in that instant her neck stretched, exposed, vulnerable. The executioner had already picked up the sword. It was not with the assistant. That was the trick, the distraction. He called for the sword to make her turn, and when she did, he struck. One stroke, clean, fast, so fast that many witnesses said they did not see it happen. One moment she was kneeling, praying. The next moment she was gone. Her head fell, her body collapsed. The crowd gasped. Some people screamed. Some wept. Some stood in shocked silence. Lancelot de Carle wrote that her lips kept moving for several minutes after her head was severed. A grim biological detail. The brain does not die instantly. For a few seconds, maybe longer, there is still activity, still some level of awareness. Did Anne's lips finish the prayer? Lord Jesus, receive my soul? We do not know, we will never know. But the thought is both horrifying and beautiful, that even in death, even after the sword fell, she was still praying, still commending her soul to Christ. Her ladies, weeping, moved forward. They wrapped her head and body in white linen, clean, pure, white. They had come prepared. They knew what needed to be done, and they did it with care, with love, with grief. There was no coffin waiting. Henry had not provided one. So they used what was available, an old elm chest, an arrow chest, the kind used to store bow staves, long enough for a body, but crude, undignified, a queen buried in an arrow box. They placed her inside, head and body together, wrapped in white linen, and they carried her to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the little chapel inside the tower, where her brother George already lay, buried 2 days earlier. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no prayers beyond what the ladies themselves might have whispered. Just a hasty burial in an unmarked grave. No stone to Hakukar, nothing to say, here lies Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. She who had been crowned in Westminster Abbey, with all the pomp and ceremony the kingdom could muster, was buried in an arrow chest in an unmarked grave. The contrast is staggering, the injustice is breathtaking, but there is something else worth noting. The chapel itself, St. Peter ad Vincula, St. Peter in chains, the patron saint of prisoners, the saint who was himself imprisoned and condemned unjustly. Anne was buried in a chapel dedicated to a saint who knew what it was like to be chained, to be accused, to face death for something beyond his control. There is a terrible poetry in that, an awful symmetry. Let us go back to the speech for a moment, because there is one more thing we need to talk about, one more layer to understand. Anne did not say goodbye to anyone, not to her daughter, not to her ladies, not to her family. Why? Because she could not. Saying Elizabeth's name on the scaffold would have drawn attention to her, would have reminded people that the king's daughter was now illegitimate, that she was the child of a woman executed for adultery and incest. Anne stayed silent about Elizabeth to protect her, to let people forget, maybe, who her mother was, to give her a chance at survival. And it worked. Elizabeth survived. Elizabeth thrived. And 22 years later, Elizabeth became Queen. Queen Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs England has ever known. Anne did not live to see it, but she made it possible by staying silent, by protecting her daughter even in her final moments, by thinking about Elizabeth's future instead of her own desperate need to say goodbye. That is love. That is sacrifice. That is a mother doing everything in her power to save her child, even when she cannot save herself. And that, more than anything else in this story, is what makes Anne Boleyn extraordinary. Not her beauty, not her wit, not her ambition, or her charm, or her tragic fall, but this, her final act of love, her seance on the scaffold, her choice to die without saying her daughter's name so that Elizabeth might live. The speech is over. The sword has fallen. Anne Boleyn is dead. But the story is not quite finished, because there is one more moment, one more detail, one more piece of this tragedy that needs to be told. The stroke of the sword, the instant of death, the final irreversible second when Anne Boleyn stopped being a living, breathing woman and became history, a memory, a legend. That moment is next, and it is both terrible and, in its own strange way, merciful, because after 17 days of waiting, after nights of sleepless prayer, after a trial and a postponement and a final morning of preparation, it was finally over, finally done, finally, blessedly the end. One stroke, and then silence, and then peace at last, kneeling, blindfolded, praying. Lord Jesus, receive my soul, Lord Jesus, receive my soul, over and over, a mantra, a lifeline, the only words left. The only thing between Anne and the end. The swordsman moved, quietly, soft-soled shoes making no sound on the wooden scaffold. He positioned himself, calculated the angle, the height, the distance, and he had done this before many times, but never for a queen, never for someone this famous, never with this many eyes watching. He needed her to turn her head, just slightly, just enough to stretch the neck, to expose the sinews, to make the strike clean, so he called out, "Bring me the sword!" Anne heard it. Of course she did. Even through prayer, even through fear, even through the blindfold, she heard. And instinctively she turned her head, just a little, following the sound, trying to hear where the assistant was, where the sword was, how much time she had left. And in that instant the swordsman struck. One stroke, swift, clean, so fast that many witnesses said they did not see it happen. One moment Anne was kneeling, alive, praying. The next moment she was gone. Her head fell into the straw, her body collapsed. The crowd gasped. Some screamed. Some wept, some stood frozen in shock because it was done. It was over. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, mother of Elizabeth, was dead. Let me tell you what the witnesses saw, because their accounts matter, because they were there, because what they describe tells us something important about Anne's final moment. Multiple sources say it took one stroke. One. The swordsman was good, he was skilled. He knew exactly what he was doing. The sword was sharp, the angle was perfect. Anne's head came off cleanly. Instantly, no botched attempts, no hacking, no suffering. For comparison, let me tell you about other executions. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was executed in 1541. She was elderly, she refused to lay her head on the block. The executioner chased her around the scaffold, hacking at her with the axe. It took 10 blows. 10. She died screaming in agony while the crowd watched in horror. Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. 3 strikes of the axe. The first one missed her neck entirely and hit the back of her head. The second one nearly severed her neck, but not quite. The third one finished the job. Except the executioner then had to use a knife to cut through the remaining sinew. It was brutal, degrading, horrifying. Anne Boleyn, 1 stroke, clean, fast, as merciful as an execution can be. Henry had paid for the best, and the best delivered. But here is the thing that makes it even more remarkable. Witnesses said that for several seconds after the stroke they were not sure what had happened. The sword was so fast, the executioner's movement so smooth, that people doubted what they had seen. Did he strike? Did it happen? Is she really dead? And then they saw the blood, and the reality hit, and the crowd erupted in reactions, weeping, gasping, some people praying, some people turning away, some people unable to look away. One witness whose account we have said something chilling. Anne's lips were still moving after her head was severed. For several minutes, according to this account, her lips continued to form words. Prayers, maybe. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. Still praying, still speaking, even in death. Now, modern medicine can explain this. When the head is severed, the brain does not die instantly. There is still oxygen in the blood for a few seconds, maybe longer. There is still electrical activity, still some level of consciousness. It is brief, but it is real. So yes, it is possible that Anne's lips kept moving, that her brain, for just a few seconds, was still trying to finish the prayer, still trying to commend her soul to Christ. It is a grim thought, a horrifying detail, but it also tells us something about who Anne was, that even in the final, literal second of her life she was focused on God, on prayer, on salvation. Her ladies rushed forward, they were sobbing. These women, who had spent 17 days with her, watching her every move, reporting her every word, now had to gather up her body, her head, the blood, the horror of it. They had come prepared. They had white linen, clean, pure white. They wrapped her head carefully, gently, with love, and they wrapped her body and they placed both in the arrow chest, that old elm box, rough wood, undignified, but it was all they had. No one had prepared a coffin for the Queen. Think about that. They built a special scaffold for her execution. They hired an expert swordsman from France. They staged the whole thing with precision and care. But no one thought to prepare a proper coffin for her body. Was it an oversight? Or was it intentional, a final insult? We do not know, but the result was the same. Anne Boleyn, who had been crowned in Westminster Abbey with all the splendour England could muster, who had worn cloth of gold and jewels, who had been Queen of England, was buried in an arrow chest. The ladies carried her to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, just steps away from the scaffold. They did not have far to go, and they laid her inside the chapel in an unmarked grave next to her brother George. No funeral, no ceremony, no bells, no mourning, just a hasty burial, a quiet disposal, as if she had never been queen at all, as if her 3 years on the throne had been erased, as if she did not matter. But here is where the story gets even darker, because on the same day that Anne was buried, the same day her blood was still fresh on the scaffold, Henry VIII did something that tells you everything you need to know about who he was. He announced his engagement to Jane Seymour the same day. Hours after Anne's death, Henry issued a marriage dispensation allowing him to marry Jane. They were related, you see, third and third degrees of affinity. Normally, you would need special permission from the church to marry someone that closely related, and Henry got that permission on May 19th, the day Anne died. 10 days later, on May 30th, Henry and Jane were married. 10 days. Anne's body was barely cold in the ground. Her daughter was still trying to understand why her mother had disappeared. The court was still processing the shock of a queen being executed, and Henry was married again, to wife number 3, starting over, as if Anne had never existed. This is what grief looked like for Henry VIII. This is what love meant to him. He could have a woman executed for crimes she did not commit, and 10 days later marry someone new, without guilt, without hesitation, without a second thought. And he moved fast. Within weeks, Jane was pregnant, or at least Henry hoped she was. That was the whole point after all. A son, an heir. The thing Anne had failed to give him, the thing that had cost her everything. Jane would eventually give Henry a son, Edward, born in October 1537, and Jane would die 12 days later from complications of childbirth. But Henry did not execute Jane. He mourned her, called her his true wife, the one he really loved, because she had given him what he wanted, a son. Anne had given him Elizabeth, the greatest queen England would ever know, but Henry did not know that, could not know that. All he knew was that Elizabeth was not a boy, and for that Anne had to die. Back to the scaffold, back to that moment when the sword fell. Because there is something else we need to talk about. The crowd, the 100 or so people who watched. What did they think? What did they feel? Some of them were Anne's enemies. Cromwell, Brandon, Henry Fitzroy. They had wanted this. They had orchestrated it. They stood there and watched her die with satisfaction probably, with relief, with the knowledge that their plan had worked. But others in the crowd were different. The French ambassador's secretary, Lancelot de Carle, who wrote that poem. He was moved, deeply affected. He described Anne as beautiful, as graceful, as dignified. He wrote that the spectators wept, that they could not help themselves, that even though Anne was accused of terrible crimes, they saw her innocence, her grace, her courage, and they cried for her, because deep down they knew it was wrong, they knew the charges were false. They knew she was dying for no good reason except that the king wanted to be rid of her. The witnesses who wept that day, who wrote about Anne's beauty and courage, they were preserving the truth. They were creating a record that would outlast Henry's propaganda, that would survive long enough for history to judge, and history has judged and found Anne innocent. But on May 19th, 1536, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Anne was dead, her head in the straw, her body in an arrow chest, her life over at 35 years old, all of her intelligence, her wit, her charm, her ambition, her faith gone, silenced, ended, and the man who had destroyed her, he was already planning his wedding. Let us talk about the aftermath for a moment, the ripple effects, the consequences. Elizabeth, 3 years old, lost her mother. She would never remember Anne, never know her, would grow up being told that her mother was a traitor, a whore, a woman executed for adultery and incest. Imagine growing up with that story. Imagine being Elizabeth, knowing that your very existence was tied to the woman who supposedly destroyed your father. But Elizabeth survived. thrived even. And when she became queen, she did not talk about Anne much, did not defend her publicly, did not try to rehabilitate her reputation. Why? Because it was safer not to. Because bringing up Anne meant bringing up the charges, the accusations, the whole ugly story. And Elizabeth was smart enough to know that silence was sometimes the best defence, so Anne was not vindicated in her daughter's lifetime, not officially. But Elizabeth wore a ring, a locket ring, and inside that ring was a tiny portrait of Anne, her mother, the woman she barely knew. Elizabeth carried Anne with her, hidden, secret, close to her heart, and that perhaps was her own quiet way of saying, I know the truth, I know who you really were. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, lost both his children in May 1536, George on the 17th, Anne on the 19th. Can you imagine your son and daughter both executed as traitors within 2 days of each other, and you are powerless to stop it? You sat on the jury that condemned your son. You did nothing to save your daughter. Thomas survived, kept his titles for a while, but he was broken, politically irrelevant, socially shunned. He died in 1539, just 3 years after Anne's execution. Some say of grief, some say of illness, but either way, he did not last long. The Boleyn family was destroyed, their name stained, their power gone, and the other men, the 5 who died with Anne, their families suffered too. Norris, Weston, Brereton, Smeaton, George, all of them dead. All of them innocent. All of them forgotten by most people, except as footnotes to Anne's story. History remembers Anne, but it barely remembers them, and that is its own injustice. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their innocence proclaimed just as loudly as Anne's, because they died for the same lie, the same political manoeuvring, the same king's whim. The scaffold was taken down, the blood was washed away. The Tower went back to business as usual. Within days, it was as if nothing had happened, as if a queen had not been executed, as if the world had not just witnessed something unprecedented and horrifying. But some things changed, forever. England had crossed a line. A king had executed his wife, not just any wife, his queen, the woman he had broken with Rome for, the woman he had made queen. And if he could do that to her, he could do it to anyone. The precedent was set. The door was opened, and Henry would walk through it again. Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, would be executed in 1542, also for adultery, also on questionable evidence, also because Henry wanted to be rid of her. Anne was the first, but she was not the last. Her death made it possible, made it thinkable, made it just another option in the king's toolkit for dealing with inconvenient wives. And that, perhaps, is her darkest legacy, not her own death, but the deaths that followed, the permission it gave, the precedent it set. But let us end this part not with Henry, not with the aftermath, not with the politics and the consequences. Let us end with Anne. In that last second, that final moment, kneeling on the scaffold, blindfolded, praying, Lord Jesu, receive my soul, and then the sword. One stroke, clean, fast, and she was free, free from fear, free from the Tower, free from Henry, free from the charges and the trial and the waiting, free from everything. Her ordeal was over, her suffering was done, and whether you believe in heaven or not, whether you think her soul went to Jesus or simply ceased to exist, one thing is certain. She was no longer in pain, no longer afraid, no longer trapped. And in that sense, the execution was mercy. Not because Henry was merciful, he was not, but because it ended her torment. It released her from the nightmare she'd been living for 17 days. For months, really, if you count the slow erosion of Henry's love. For years, if you count the pressure and the miscarriages and the desperate attempts to give him a son. One stroke, and it was over. And whatever comes after death, Anne Boleyn faced it with courage, with dignity, with her faith intact, and that is how we should remember her. Not broken, not begging, not defeated, but strong, graceful, brave, right to the very end. The sword has fallen. Anne is gone. But there is one more thing left to say, one more chapter in this story, because Anne's death is not the end. It is the beginning of a legacy that would outlast Henry, outlast Cromwell, outlast everyone who destroyed her. That legacy is Elizabeth, and it is the truth, and it is the question that echoes through 500 years. How could they do this to her? And more importantly, how do we make sure it never happens again? Those questions are still waiting, still demanding answers, and we will get to them. But first, let us sit with this moment, this stroke, this end, this breath of silence after the sword fell and before the world moved on. Rest now, Anne. Your fight is over. Your truth remains. 22 years. That is how long Elizabeth waited. 22 years from the day her mother died on the scaffold to the day she became queen. 22 years of surviving, of keeping quiet, of playing the long game, of being smart enough not to get herself killed. November 17th, 1558. Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's half-sister, died at age 42. And at Hatfield House, according to tradition, Elizabeth was sitting under an oak tree, reading a book when the Lords of the Council arrived. They came to tell her that Mary was dead, that she was now queen. Elizabeth fell to her knees, and she said in Latin, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvellous in our eyes." 25 years old, illegitimate by law, the daughter of a woman executed as a traitor, and yet here she was, Queen of England, against all odds, against all expectations, against everything that had been designed to erase her, to diminish her, to destroy her. The girl whose mother was beheaded when she was 2 years old had just become the most powerful person in the country, and she would go on to become one of the greatest monarchs England would ever see. This is Anne Boleyn's legacy, not her death, not her fall, not the scaffold or the sword or the arrow chest, but Elizabeth, the daughter who survived, the daughter who thrived, the daughter who proved them all wrong. Let us talk about what Elizabeth inherited, because when she became queen in 1558, England was a mess. Mary's reign had been disastrous. 5 years of religious persecution, hundreds of Protestants burned at the stake, failed marriage to Philip of Spain that dragged England into expensive wars, economic depression, failed harvests, the loss of Calais, England's lost territory in France, and widespread fear that Elizabeth, like her mother, would be overthrown or executed. Elizabeth was also illegitimate, officially. Her parents' marriage had been annulled before Anne's execution, so technically Elizabeth had no legal right to the throne at all. She was there only because Parliament had restored her to the line of succession years earlier, and even that was shaky ground. Catholic Europe did not recognise her as queen. The Pope certainly did not. They saw Mary, Queen of Scots, as the rightful Queen of England, a Catholic queen, a legitimate queen, not this Protestant bastard daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman who had destroyed the Catholic Church in England. So Elizabeth's position was precarious, dangerous. She could have been deposed within months, years at best. No one expected her to last. No one expected her to succeed. She was a woman, after all, in an era when women were considered fundamentally unfit to rule. She was illegitimate. She was Protestant in a world where powerful Catholic countries wanted to crush her. And she had no husband, no male protector, no one to give her legitimacy or authority. But Elizabeth had something else. She had her mother's intelligence, her father's political cunning, and an iron will to survive, because she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Every time she had been imprisoned, every time she had been accused of treason, every time she had narrowly avoided execution, she had learned, she had watched. She had studied how to stay alive in a court that wanted her dead. And now she was in charge, and she was going to show them all exactly what the daughter of Anne Boleyn could do. Elizabeth's reign lasted 45 years, from 1558 to 1603. 45 years. Longer than any Tudor monarch before her, longer than her father, longer than her grandfather, longer than anyone expected. And during those 45 years, she transformed England from a vulnerable, divided, bankrupt island into a world power. Let me give you some highlights, some of the things Elizabeth achieved, because this list is staggering. She established the Church of England in a form that has lasted for centuries, a compromise between Catholic and Protestant, a middle way, not too radical, not too conservative, just enough to keep most people satisfied, and it worked. England avoided the religious wars that tore France apart, the bloodshed that consumed the Netherlands, the chaos that destroyed Germany. Elizabeth's religious settlement gave England stability, and stability allowed everything else to flourish. She defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. Spain at the time was the most powerful empire in the world. Philip II, Elizabeth's former brother-in-law, decided to invade England, to conquer it, to depose Elizabeth, to restore Catholicism by force. He assembled a fleet of 130 ships, the largest invasion force Europe had ever seen, and England, with its small navy and limited resources, was supposed to lose. Everyone thought so. Europe was already preparing for Elizabeth's downfall. But she did not lose. She gave a speech at Tilbury that has gone down in history. She told her troops, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." And her navy, with the help of terrible storms, destroyed the Armada. Spain's power was shattered. England's confidence soared, and Elizabeth became a legend. Under her reign, English explorers circumnavigated the globe. Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, John Hawkins, they sailed to the New World, they raided Spanish ports. They brought back treasure. They established colonies. They turned England into a maritime power, and they laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the British Empire. And then there was the cultural explosion, the Elizabethan era, the flowering of English literature and drama, William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser. These men wrote during Elizabeth's reign. They were inspired by her reign, by the stability she created, by the confidence she instilled, by the sense that England was special, chosen, destined for greatness. Shakespeare never knew Anne Boleyn, but he knew Elizabeth. And in a very real sense, Shakespeare exists because of Anne, because without Anne there would be no Elizabeth, and without Elizabeth there might be no Shakespeare, no English Renaissance, no golden age of English drama and poetry. The cultural legacy that we still celebrate today was made possible by the woman who died on the scaffold in 1536. Think about that. Anne Boleyn's execution was supposed to erase her, to destroy her legacy, to wipe her from history. Instead, her daughter created a legacy so powerful that it has lasted 500 years. But Elizabeth never spoke publicly about Anne, not once. In 45 years as queen, she never defended her mother, never proclaimed her innocence, never tried to rehabilitate her reputation. Why? Because it was too dangerous, because mentioning Anne meant mentioning the charges, the accusations, the scandal, and Elizabeth could not afford to remind people of that. She had to be legitimate, she had to be untouchable, she had to be the Virgin Queen, married to England above reproach. Talking about her mother would have undermined all of that. So Elizabeth was silent, publicly, but privately. Privately, she carried Anne with her. She wore a locket ring, a piece of jewellery that opened to reveal 2 miniature portraits, one of Elizabeth herself, and one of Anne, her mother, the woman she barely remembered, the woman she could never acknowledge, but the woman she never forgot. Elizabeth wore that ring until the day she died. It was removed from her finger when she died in 1603 and sent to James VI of Scotland to inform him that he was now king. But for 45 years, Elizabeth had carried her mother's portrait next to her heart, hidden, secret, but always there. That was Elizabeth's private tribute to Anne, a silent acknowledgement that she knew. She knew her mother was innocent. She knew the charges were false. She knew Anne had been murdered. And even though she could never say it out loud, even though she could never defend her publicly, she could carry her in secret, and that would have to be enough. Anne's vindication did not come from Elizabeth, though. It came from history. It came from the people who watched her die and knew it was wrong. It came from the witnesses who wrote about her courage, her grace, her dignity. It came from the records that were preserved, the letters, the documents, the accounts, all of which slowly, over centuries, revealed the truth. Within decades of her death, Anne was being rehabilitated. Protestant writers, particularly John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs, began portraying Anne as a martyr for the Reformation, a woman who died for her faith, who supported Protestant reform, who distributed English Bibles, who protected scholars, who championed the cause of breaking from Rome. And in their telling, Anne was not a traitor. She was a hero, a victim of a tyrant king and a corrupt system. Thomas Cranmer, Anne's friend who had heard her last confession and given her communion before her execution, never forgot her. He wrote a letter to Henry on May 3rd, 1536, the day after Anne was arrested, expressing his shock and disbelief. He wrote, "I never had better opinion in woman than I had in her." It was a dangerous thing to write. It could have cost him his life, but Cranmer wrote it anyway, because he believed in Anne, and he wanted the record to show that someone had defended her. Cranmer survived Henry. He went on to become the architect of the English Reformation under Edward VI. He created the Book of Common Prayer. He established the Protestant Church that Elizabeth would later perfect. And when Mary Tudor came to power and tried to restore Catholicism, Cranmer was burned at the stake. He died a martyr, just like Anne. And in his final moments, he thrust his right hand into the flames first, because that was the hand that had signed documents he regretted, including, perhaps, the annulment of Anne's marriage. Cranmer's legacy became intertwined with Anne's. They were both reformers, both victims of political persecution, both people who believed in something bigger than themselves and paid for it with their lives. And Elizabeth benefited from both of them. Cranmer's church, Anne's courage. Together they gave Elizabeth the foundation she needed to build her reign. But the real vindication came from Elizabeth herself, not through words but through actions, through her reign, through her success, through the fact that she became everything Henry had wanted in a son and everything Anne had hoped for in a daughter. Henry wanted a strong ruler, he got Elizabeth. Henry wanted military victories. Elizabeth defeated the Spanish Armada. Henry wanted England to be respected on the world stage. Elizabeth made England a superpower. Henry wanted a secure succession. Well, Elizabeth did not give him that. She never married, never had children. But she gave England stability for 45 years, and when she died, she passed the throne peacefully to James VI of Scotland, uniting England and Scotland under one crown. The Tudor dynasty ended, but it ended on her terms. Anne wanted her daughter to survive. Elizabeth did. Anne wanted the Reformation to continue. Elizabeth ensured it did. Anne wanted England to break free from Rome. Elizabeth made that break permanent. Anne wanted to be remembered, and through Elizabeth she has been, forever. So yes, Anne was executed. Yes, her reputation was destroyed. Yes, she was buried in an arrow chest in an unmarked grave. But her daughter wore the crown for 45 years. Her daughter became Gloriana, good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen, one of the most celebrated monarchs in history. And every time someone praised Elizabeth, every time someone marvelled at her intelligence or her political skill or her strength, they were indirectly praising Anne. Because Elizabeth was Anne's daughter, through and through, and everyone knew it. There is a quote attributed to Elizabeth, though we cannot confirm she actually said it, but it captures the spirit of what she must have felt. "I am my father's daughter, but I am my mother's daughter too." And that says it all. Because Elizabeth had Henry's political instincts, his ruthlessness when necessary, his ability to command, but she also had Anne's intelligence, her grace, her wit, her ability to survive in a hostile world, her commitment to reform, her faith. Anne did not live to see any of this. She died thinking her daughter would grow up as a bastard, powerless, forgotten, maybe even executed just like her mother. Anne had no way of knowing that Elizabeth would become queen, that she would reign for 45 years, that she would transform England, that she would become a legend. But Anne planted the seed. She gave England the break from Rome. She championed the English Bible. She supported the reformers. She pushed Henry to take the steps that would eventually lead to the Protestant Church. And she gave birth to Elizabeth, the girl who would finish what Anne started. That is legacy. That is vindication. That is justice, even if it took decades to arrive. Anne Boleyn did not die in vain. She died for a future she would never see. But that future came, and it was glorious. In 1806, more than 300 years after Anne's execution, her grave was opened during renovations to the Chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. They found her bones, small bones, a woman about 5 feet tall, buried next to her brother George, in the chancel near the altar, not in the yard with the other executed prisoners. Someone had cared enough to bury her in a place of honour. Or maybe it was just chance, we do not know, but in 1806 they reburied her with dignity, with a proper marker, with recognition. And today, visitors to the Tower of London can see a memorial plaque. It lists the names of those buried in the chapel, and Anne's name is there. Queen Anne Boleyn, not traitor, not adulteress, queen, because that is what she was. That is what she died as, even if her marriage was annulled. That is what history has decided she deserves to be called. And every year on May 19th, people gather at the tower to remember her, to pay their respects, to lay flowers, to acknowledge what was done to her, to say, we know it was wrong. We know you were innocent. We know you deserved better. 500 years later, Anne Boleyn is still remembered, still honoured, still fascinating, still inspiring. And the men who destroyed her? Thomas Cromwell, executed in 1540. Thomas Audley died in 1544, largely forgotten. Charles Brandon died in 1545, remembered mostly as Henry's friend, not for any great achievements. Henry Fitzroy died in 1536, just 2 months after Anne at 17 years old. Even Henry himself, for all his power and all his wives and all his achievements, is remembered as much for his cruelty as for his greatness. But Anne is remembered as a victim, a martyr, a reformer, a mother, a queen, the woman who changed England forever. The woman whose daughter became one of the greatest monarchs in history. That is what happens when you try to erase someone from history. Sometimes you end up making them immortal instead. So what can we learn from Anne Boleyn's story? What does it mean for us 500 years later? First, the truth does come out. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in your lifetime, but eventually the truth finds its way to the surface. The witnesses who wept at Anne's execution preserved the record. The documents survived, the letters remained, and slowly over centuries historians pieced together what really happened, and they exonerated her, completely, unanimously. There is not a serious historian alive today who believes Anne was guilty of the charges against her. The verdict is in. She was innocent. Justice took 500 years, but it came. Second, legacy is not about how you die. It is about what you leave behind. Anne died horribly, unjustly, tragically. But she left behind Elizabeth. She left behind the English Reformation. She left behind a story that has inspired millions. She left behind a legacy that has outlasted everyone who tried to destroy her. And that matters more than the scaffold, more than the sword, more than the 17 days in the tower. Third, never underestimate a woman, especially a smart one, especially one who has been underestimated her entire life. Anne was dismissed as a seductress, a schemer, a woman who got lucky, but she was so much more than that. She was intelligent, educated, politically savvy, committed to reform. And her daughter Elizabeth was the same, dismissed, underestimated, expected to fail, and instead she became Gloriana. So when someone tells you that women cannot lead, that women are too emotional, that women are not strong enough, remember Anne and Elizabeth, and know that history has proven those people wrong, over and over again, and finally courage matters. Anne could have broken. She could have confessed to crimes she did not commit in exchange for her life. She could have begged. She could have grovelled, but she did not. She maintained her innocence. She swore on the sacrament. She faced death with dignity. And that courage has echoed through 500 years. It inspired Elizabeth. It inspired the Protestants who followed. It inspires us today, because courage is contagious, and Anne had it in abundance. Anne Boleyn's story is not just history. It is a reminder, a lesson, a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked, when politics trump justice, when lies are more convenient than truth, when women are disposable, when ambition is more important than morality. But it is also a story of hope, of resilience, of legacy, of the fact that even when everything is taken from you, even when you are destroyed, erased, forgotten, sometimes your daughter becomes queen, sometimes your legacy outlasts your enemies, sometimes history vindicates you, sometimes you win even when you lose. Anne Boleyn lost everything in May 1536, her crown, her freedom, her life, but in the long run she won, because her daughter ruled for 45 years, because the Reformation she championed succeeded, because her story has been told and retold for 5 centuries, because we are still talking about her, still remembering her, still marvelling at her courage and her intelligence and her tragic unjust end. Henry thought he could erase her. He was wrong. Cromwell thought he could destroy her. He failed. History thought it could forget her. It could not. Anne Boleyn is immortal, not because of how she died, but because of how she lived, and because of what she left behind. A daughter who became a legend, a church that still exists, a story that still inspires, and that in the end is the greatest revenge, the ultimate vindication, the final victory. Anne Boleyn may have died on May 19th, 1536, but her legacy will live forever. Rest in peace, Anne. Your daughter proved them all wrong, and history has given you the justice you deserved. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Anne Boleyn's final quiet hours, from the moment she was arrested to the sword that fell to the daughter who wore the crown. We have walked through 17 days that changed history, 17 days that revealed courage, injustice, transformation, and ultimately triumph. Anne's story is one of the most powerful reminders that legacy is not determined by those who destroy you, but by what you leave behind. And what Anne left behind changed the world. If you have made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about this story. Thank you for remembering Anne. Because as long as we tell her story, as long as we refuse to forget, she wins every single time. There are so many more stories like this. So many forgotten women, so many untold histories, so many moments that shaped our world in ways we never learned in school, and I cannot wait to share them with you. So stay tuned. Subscribe if you have not already, because the next story is waiting, and trust me, it is going to be just as fascinating, just as powerful, just as unforgettable. Until then, sleep well, dream of oak trees and locket rings, and daughters who became queens, and remember, the truth always finds its way to the light. Always. Good night.